The file was classified before it was ever written. That is what makes this anomaly so difficult to trace. Somewhere beneath the Pentagon, inside a structure that has been measured, mapped, and audited for decades, there exists a space that does not appear on any official blueprint. Not a forgotten storage room, not an abandoned hallway, but an entire floor that should, by all architectural logic, be impossible. Engineers noticed it only after something went wrong. A line on a diagram failed to connect. A wall extended too far. A measurement did not resolve. The discrepancy was small, almost dismissible, yet it repeated across multiple versions of the same file. Each time, the same absence. Each time, the same silent correction. And each time, the correction removed the flaw entirely, as if it had never been there at all. This is not a rumor. It is not a ghost story told by former employees. It is a documented anomaly buried inside classified architectural records, encrypted planning documents, and erased revisions that survive only because no system is ever perfect. The Pentagon is one of the most studied buildings on Earth. Its geometry is taught in engineering courses. Its corridors are measured in miles. And yet, according to a narrow set of internal records, there is a structural inconsistency that no one has ever publicly explained. A hidden truth sealed not by secrecy alone, but by omission, that the first reference appears indirectly, in a facilities maintenance file dated March 1993. During a routine renovation of the building's inner ring, a contractor flagged a spatial conflict. The report noted that a load-bearing column extended through a space that should have been hollow. The language was technical, unemotional, precise, but attached to the report was a handwritten annotation, later scanned and partially erased, instructing the contractor to halt work immediately. No reason was given. The next page of the file was missing entirely. In its place was a stamp, classified, access restricted, file archived. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. Before we continue, it helps to slow the pace. To imagine the environment where such a discrepancy could survive unnoticed. The Pentagon is not silent. It hums. Air circulates constantly. Servers vibrate behind locked doors. Fluorescent lighting casts a steady, artificial daylight across endless corridors. Paper files exist alongside encrypted databases, some yellowed with age, others freshly printed, all governed by layers of access control. In this environment, anomalies do not announce themselves. They whisper, they wait. The blueprint in question was not a single drawing. It was a series, revisions spanning decades, each one slightly altered, each one correcting minor errors. But when these revisions were overlaid digitally in the early 1990s, an analyst noticed something unusual. The same internal section was adjusted repeatedly. Walls were shifted by inches, staircases ended abruptly, elevator shafts changed alignment, and always, the same solution was applied. The space was removed. What makes this significant is not the mistake itself. Large buildings contain errors. What makes it unsettling is the consistency of the correction. No alternative configuration was ever offered. No explanation was documented. The missing flaw was not redesigned. It was erased. In April 1993, a temporary renovation crew was assigned to the affected area. According to a payroll document later obtained through a limited disclosure request, the crew was dismissed mid. Their access badges were deactivated within minutes. The work order was closed without completion, and the crew's names do not appear again in Pentagon contracting records. There is no indication of misconduct, no disciplinary notes, just absence. At this point in the file, the language changes. Early sections are procedural, mundane. Later sections become vague. References are replaced with codes. Descriptions are shortened. One memo refers to the lower architectural variance without specifying its location. Another mentions non-standard substructural continuity. These are not phrases used in civilian construction. They are defensive, designed to obscure rather than clarify. To understand why this matters, we need to consider how blueprints function inside federal architecture. A blueprint is not merely a map. It is a legal document. It determines funding, maintenance, schedules, security zones, and emergency response protocols. A space that does not exist on a blueprint cannot be officially entered, serviced, or acknowledged. It becomes invisible by policy. And yet, invisibility does not equal emptiness. In 1943, when construction of the Pentagon was completed, the building was designed for speed, not perfection. Built during wartime, it prioritized functionality. Records from that era show numerous last-minute adjustments, undocumented changes made to accommodate evolving needs. Most were corrected later. Some were not, but none, according to public records, involved the complete removal of an entire floor from all documentation. That the idea that such a space could persist undetected strains belief, until one considers the scale of the building and the compartmentalization of its records. Different departments maintain different maps. Security maintains one version, facilities maintains another, emergency planning uses a third. These versions are rarely compared in full. When they are, discrepancies are usually resolved quietly. In 1994, an internal audit attempted such a comparison. The audit's summary exists, its findings do not. The final paragraph states only that all identified inconsistencies were addressed in accordance with standing protocols. The phrase standing protocols appears nowhere else in the document. One retired facilities engineer, speaking years later under condition of anonymity, described a moment of confusion during that audit. He recalled tracing a corridor that, according to his map, should have intersected a stairwell. Instead, it terminated at a blank wall, no door, no signage, just painted concrete. When he asked about it, he was told he was holding an outdated map. When he requested an updated one, he was reassigned. These stories, taken alone, explain little. Together, they suggest a pattern, a deliberate effort not to hide something in the conventional sense, but to remove it from consideration entirely, to ensure that no one thinks to ask the wrong question. What could require such treatment? Not a storage room, not an office. Those can be acknowledged. The missing floor appears to exist in a category outside normal use, one that requires not just secrecy, but conceptual absence. As we approach the end of this section, the question remains deliberately unanswered. If a floor exists that cannot be mapped, cannot be accessed through official channels, and cannot be acknowledged by policy, then how is it maintained? How is it secured? And more importantly, who is allowed to remember it? The answer does not appear in this file. It appears, indirectly, in what happened next, when a routine renovation revealed more than a measurement error, and forced a decision that would echo through every record that followed. The next trace of the missing floor appears not in an architectural document, but in a logistics ledger. Dated June 1993, it records the delivery of reinforced steel panels to the Pentagon. Panels rated far beyond the requirements of standard interior construction. The destination field is partially redacted, but the internal routing code corresponds to the same inner ring affected by the earlier discrepancy. What stands out is not the delivery itself, but the absence of a corresponding installation record. The materials arrived, they were signed for, and then they vanished from the system. In federal facilities management, nothing vanishes accidentally. Every material movement is tracked for liability reasons alone, yet in this case, the ledger ends without resolution. No follow-up, no audit note, just a silent termination of the record, as if the materials had fulfilled a purpose that could not be named. Around this time, access protocols within the affected sector were quietly altered, badge readers were upgraded, motion sensors were recalibrated. A memo circulated reminding staff that certain areas were designated as non-navigable due to structural limitations. The phrase was unusual. Buildings do not become non-navigable without explanation. Still, no explanation was provided. To understand how such changes could be implemented without wider awareness, it is important to understand the Pentagon's internal hierarchy of knowledge. Most personnel operate within narrow lanes of responsibility. A security officer knows his checkpoint, an engineer knows her subsystem. Very few individuals possess a complete spatial understanding of the building. This fragmentation is not accidental, it is a feature. In this environment, a space can exist without existing. It can be maintained by one group, secured by another, and omitted from the awareness of everyone else. The missing floor appears to have been managed in precisely this way. Its existence was not denied, it was simply never confirmed. In August 1993, an internal communication referenced a vertical continuity adjustment. The term suggests a modification to how levels align, but no such adjustment appears in public renovation records. The memo includes a single sentence that was later blacked out in all released versions. The remaining text instructs recipients to disregard previous assumptions regarding sublevel enumeration. Sublevel enumeration is the process by which floors are numbered, labeled, and indexed. To disregard it is to abandon the basic logic by which a building is understood. Historical context matters here. The early 1990s were a period of transition for the Department of Defense. The Cold War had ended, budgets were being re-evaluated, systems were being modernized, and older, more opaque projects were being quietly retired or sealed. It is within this atmosphere of reorganization that the missing floor becomes most plausible, not as a new construction, but as a remnant, something built for a purpose that no longer existed, yet could not be dismantled. One plausible explanation proposed internally, according to a later analysis, was that the floor housed analog systems incompatible with modern infrastructure, systems that could not be digitized without compromising their function. If true, this would explain the absence of digital records, and the reliance on paper files that were later erased. It would also explain the emphasis on physical barriers, reinforced materials, and access control. But this explanation raises another question. Why not document it as a legacy system? Why remove it entirely from the blueprint? In September 1993, a fire safety review noted irregularities in evacuation modeling. Certain simulations failed when applied to the inner ring. The software could not reconcile the vertical spacing. Rather than investigate further, the parameters were adjusted until the models produced acceptable results. The anomaly was resolved mathematically, not physically. This pattern repeats across disciplines. When confronted with evidence of the missing floor, systems were adjusted to ignore it, maps were corrected, models were tuned, files were archived. Each response treated the anomaly not as a problem to be solved, but as a variable to be eliminated. There is a psychological dimension to this approach. Institutions, like individuals, avoid questions that destabilize their foundational assumptions. A building that cannot be fully mapped challenges the premise of control, and control is central to the Pentagon's identity. By late 1993, references to the discrepancy cease almost entirely. The record goes quiet. No more memos, no more flagged reports. The missing floor fades into administrative silence. But silence, in archival work, is rarely the end of a story. It is often the sign that a different method of record-keeping has begun. Years later, during a digitization initiative, a batch of microfilm was discovered mislabeled in a storage vault. The images were degraded, but one frame showed a sectional drawing inconsistent with all known blueprints. The lower levels were compressed. One band of space appeared darker, thicker, more heavily reinforced. There were no labels, only measurements, and those measurements did not align with any known flaw. The frame was the digital copy failed. The original microfilm was returned to storage. When archivists attempted to retrieve it again, it could not be located. The catalog entry remained. The item did not. This is how the story persists. Not through dramatic revelation, but through small failures of alignment. A measurement that does not resolve. A record that ends too soon. A space that cannot be reconciled with the models designed to explain it. As this section closes, the missing flaw remains undefined. We know only that it disrupted systems designed to measure, simulate, and control, and that when confronted directly, those systems adapted by pretending the disruption was not there. What happened next would force a more tangible confrontation, when human presence, not software, encountered the limits of the building's official reality, and discovered that some doors were never meant to be opened. The first direct human encounter with the limits of the official record occurred quietly, without incident reports or formal complaints. It began with a maintenance request. In November 1993, a facilities technician submitted a routine ticket noting abnormal temperature readings in a section of the inner ring. The request was ordinary. Airflow inconsistencies happen in large buildings, but the resolution path was not. The technician was instructed to follow a service corridor that, according to his map, should have led to a ventilation junction. Instead, it ended at a reinforced wall. Unlike the painted concrete barriers elsewhere in the building, this surface was unfinished. Bare steel plates bolted into place, edges sealed with industrial compound. There was no signage, no warning, only a small access panel, locked and unmarked. The technician logged the obstruction as an error. The ticket was closed within the hour. His supervisor later told him the corridor had been decommissioned. When he asked why it still appeared on his map, he was told to discard the map. This interaction, though minor, reveals a critical aspect of the missing flaw. It is not entirely sealed off. It intersects with functional systems. Air circulates. Heat is exchanged. Power lines pass nearby. These interfaces require ongoing management. Someone, somewhere, must maintain them. Maintenance logs from the period show a curious pattern. Work orders referencing the affected zone are rerouted. Responsibilities are reassigned. Tasks are marked complete without description. The language becomes formulaic, almost ritualistic. Each entry follows the same structure, the same phrasing, as if copied from a template designed to avoid specificity. In December 1993, a training memo was distributed to facility staff. It reminded employees that not all spatial inconsistencies indicated errors. Some, it stated, were the result of legacy design constraints. The memo advised against pursuing clarification beyond one's assigned scope. This was not standard guidance. It was a subtle directive to stop asking questions. From a historical perspective, this approach mirrors practices used during the height of the Cold War. Sensitive installations were often embedded within larger structures, concealed not by secrecy alone, but by complexity. The more confusing a system became, the easier it was to hide anomalies within it. A comparison with other government buildings supports this interpretation. In the 1950s and 1960s, several federal facilities incorporated hidden levels for secure communications, hardened against electromagnetic interference. These levels were sometimes omitted from public plans, but they were documented internally. The missing floor differs in one key respect. It is undocumented even where documentation would be expected. By early 1994, the physical evidence becomes harder to trace. Renovations in the inner ring were completed, new walls were installed, corridors were rerouted. The building's internal geography shifted just enough to absorb the anomaly. The missing floor did not disappear. It was integrated into the noise of constant change. Yet traces remain. In a security upgrade report from February 1994, a brief reference appears to non-standard vertical separation zones. The term is undefined. The report recommends enhanced access controls in these zones, citing structural uniqueness. No further explanation is offered. Security protocols are often revealing in what they imply without stating. To designate a zone as structurally unique is to acknowledge that it does not conform to expected patterns, and to apply enhanced controls is to treat it as sensitive. At this point, speculation becomes unavoidable. What function could require such treatment? Theories range from hardened command facilities to experimental infrastructure. Some suggest the floor was designed to house early data processing systems isolated from external networks. Others propose it served as a contingency space, meant to be occupied only under specific conditions. What all credible theories share is restraint. There is no evidence of fantastical technology, no indication of anything beyond the known capabilities of the era. The unsettling aspect lies not in what the space might contain, but in how thoroughly it has been removed from institutional memory. In archival research, erasure is rarely total. It leaves patterns. It leaves gaps that repeat. The missing floor is defined by such repetition. Every system that encounters it responds in the same way. It adjusts. It avoids. It moves on. By mid-1994, references cease almost entirely. The building stabilizes. New maps are issued. Old ones are destroyed. Personnel rotate. Knowledge fragments further. The opportunity for rediscovery diminishes, and yet, the building remains. Its mass unchanged. Its geometry intact. Somewhere within that geometry, a volume of space persists that does not correspond to any official understanding. It exists in the negative, defined not by what is known, but by what has been deliberately forgotten. As we move forward, the focus shifts from space to policy, from physical absence to administrative intent, because the most revealing evidence is not found in walls or corridors, but in the decisions that ensured no one would ever be authorized to ask why a floor was missing. From every Pentagon blueprint, the decision to erase a floor from every official blueprint did not occur spontaneously. It required authorization. It required consensus across departments that rarely agree, and it required a justification strong enough to override established documentation protocols. That justification does not appear directly in any surviving record, but its outline can be reconstructed by examining what changed immediately afterward. In early 1994, a new internal directive circulated among senior administrative officers. The document itself remains classified, but references to it appear in secondary memos. It is described as a clarification regarding architectural abstraction standards. The phrase is deliberately vague. Architecture, in this context, is treated not as a physical reality, but as a conceptual model. An abstraction can omit details deemed unnecessary or inconvenient. Following this directive, a coordinated update occurred. Facilities maps were revised. Emergency response plans were recalculated. Security zoning diagrams were simplified. In each case, the missing floor was not addressed. It was assumed away. The building was redefined in a manner that rendered the anomaly irrelevant. This approach mirrors a known bureaucratic technique. When a problem cannot be solved, redefine the system so the problem no longer exists. It is efficient, it leaves no loose ends, and it produces records that are internally consistent, even if they no longer correspond to reality. A key moment appears in a budget reconciliation document from May 1994. A line item for structural maintenance was the description was truncated. Funds previously assigned to a specific vertical segment were redistributed under a general facilities category. The change eliminated the last financial trace of the missing floor as a distinct entity. Without a budget, it ceased to exist administratively. At the same time, access control policies were quietly adjusted. Clearance tiers were redefined. Certain badge privileges were removed. Others were narrowed. The result was a system in which no single individual retained both the authorization and the contextual knowledge required to access the missing floor intentionally. Any access that did occur would appear accidental, unauthorized, or anomalous. This fragmentation of responsibility is a recurring theme. It ensures deniability. If no one is officially responsible, no one can be held accountable. And if no one can be held accountable, no inquiry can proceed. There is one final trace from this period that deserves attention. In July 1994, a classified briefing summary mentions legacy containment considerations. The phrase appears only once. It is not defined, but containment, in institutional language, implies control of something that persists, something that cannot be removed, only managed. This suggests that the missing floor was not erased because it was empty. It was erased because it was still in use, or at least, still relevant. The absence of subsequent references does not indicate resolution. It indicates stabilization. The system adapted. The anomaly was absorbed into the structure of policy itself. From that point forward, the missing floor no longer generated errors, because the systems designed to detect errors had been reconfigured to ignore it. By the end of 1994, the Pentagon's official architectural record was complete. Every floor accounted for, every corridor mapped, every anomaly resolved, on paper. But buildings are not paper. They retain their original dimensions. They remember what was built, regardless of what is acknowledged. Somewhere beneath the layers of revision, the physical reality remained unchanged. The erasure was successful, so successful that even those who enacted it may no longer recall the specifics. Institutional memory decays, personnel retire, context dissolves. What remains is a gap so well maintained that it appears natural. As this section draws toward its close, the missing floor has transitioned from a discovery to a decision, from an error to a policy. It is no longer something that can be found by accident. It is something that must be deliberately sought, and that raises the final question of this subtitle. If a space exists that no one is authorized to acknowledge, what happens when someone enters it without permission, not through a map or a model, but through a door that was never meant to be used? The answer begins with a renovation crew that did not know what they were about to uncover, and a moment when a mission failed, briefly, before being restored. The renovation crew arrived early in the morning, assigned to a narrow window of work intended to resolve what had been categorized as a structural alignment issue. The order was routine. The instructions were minimal. The location was specified only by internal routing codes that did not correspond to any publicly available map. The crew followed the directions as given, unaware that they were approaching a boundary the building itself no longer acknowledged. That the access point was not marked as restricted. It was simply unremarkable. A service door recessed into a corridor that appeared no different from dozens of others. The badge reader accepted their credentials. The door opened up beyond it. The space did not behave as expected. The air was cooler. The sound changed. Footsteps echoed with a density inconsistent with the surrounding structure. The crew's foreman noted the discrepancy but proceeded. Inside, the vertical geometry felt compressed, as if the distance between levels had been altered deliberately. The walls were reinforced beyond standard specification. There were no windows, no signage, only infrastructure. They did not remain long. According to the only surviving account, an automated alarm triggered within minutes. Not a fire alarm, not a security alert. A containment signal routed through a system the crew had never encountered. Security personnel arrived almost immediately. The crew was escorted out without explanation. Their tools were confiscated. Their access privileges were revoked before they reached the exit. The incident generated no formal report. Instead, it produced a policy adjustment. Within days, the access route they had used was removed from all internal navigation systems. The door was sealed. The corridor was rerouted. The moment of direct contact was erased with the same efficiency that had removed the floor itself. This was the last recorded accidental entry. After that point, the architecture and the policy were aligned. No map led to the space. No authorization permitted entry. The missing floor was no longer vulnerable to discovery. It had transitioned fully from physical anomaly to controlled absence. From an archival perspective, this marks the conclusion of Subtitle 1. The floor was identified. It was questioned, and it was deliberately removed from every system designed to describe the building. What remains is not evidence of what the space contains, but proof of intent. Someone decided that this floor should not exist. Not because it could not be explained, but because acknowledging it posed a greater risk than concealing it. The story does not end here. It pauses. Because once a space has been erased from every blueprint, the next question is not what it is, but how it continues to be secured, monitored, and quietly maintained in a building that insists it was never there at all. That question opens the next file. The discovery did not begin with curiosity. It began with a renovation schedule, a line item buried inside a maintenance calendar approved months in advance. In early 1993, the Pentagon initiated a routine internal upgrade. Aging electrical conduits were to be replaced. Ventilation shafts were to be inspected. Nothing in the project description suggested risk, secrecy, or deviation from established architectural plans. And yet, this renovation would expose an anomaly so deeply embedded that it would force an immediate and permanent rewrite of the building's official reality. The file that authorized the work was classified at a low level, standard for infrastructure projects in sensitive areas. It contained diagrams, timelines, and access permissions. Everything appeared normal, until one section failed to align. A sublevel referenced only indirectly did not correspond to any known floor. The discrepancy was subtle, but it repeated across multiple documents. When engineers attempted to reconcile the conflict, they encountered an absence, a blank space where a structure should have been, an erased layer inside an otherwise complete file. This was not an error caused by damage or decay. It was an intentional omission, an encrypted absence preserved through revision after revision. The anomaly suggested that something had been removed not physically, but administratively, a hidden truth embedded in the architecture itself. During the first week of the renovation, crews followed approved routes and accessed designated service areas. Then, on the fourth day, a demolition team removed a section of interior wall that was not scheduled for replacement. Behind it was a sealed access shaft, not marked, not labeled, reinforced far beyond the surrounding structure. According to later testimony, the seal bore no warning symbols, only industrial fasteners and a secondary layer of shielding inconsistent with standard construction. The discovery was reported immediately. Within hours, the worksite was shut down. Access to the affected zone was restricted. Security personnel arrived without prior notice. All digital records related to the renovation were temporarily frozen. The file that initiated the project was flagged, encrypted, and removed from the shared system. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The only sound in the archive room is the quiet hum of ventilation. Fluorescent lights flicker with mechanical patience. The paper file, when retrieved years later, feels heavier than expected, its cover cold beneath the fingertips. Ink has faded where names once appeared. Pages smell faintly of dust and chemical preservation. This is the atmosphere in which the story continues, not with alarm, but with restraint. The 1993 renovation was not unusual in scope. The Pentagon, completed in 1943, requires constant maintenance. Electrical systems designed for wartime loads had been retrofitted repeatedly. Ventilation had been expanded to support modern computing infrastructure. Sub-basements existed. Utility tunnels crisscrossed beneath the structure. None of this was secret. What was secret was the configuration revealed when the sealed shaft was partially breached. Measurements taken by the crew indicated a vertical span inconsistent with known. The space extended deeper than documented. Its dimensions did not match any recorded basement, and its orientation suggested deliberate integration into the building's core. A structural engineer assigned to the project later described the moment as disorienting. According to his account, the geometry felt wrong. The distance between load-bearing supports was shorter. The materials absorbed sound differently. It was not an unfinished area. It was complete, functional, and deliberately hidden. Within 24 hours, a revised directive was issued. The renovation was suspended indefinitely. The affected area was declared off-limits under a new classification code. Workers were reassigned. Non-disclosure agreements were updated retroactively. The discovery was not denied, it was compartmentalized. This response indicates prior knowledge. Institutions do not improvise classification protocols overnight. The speed and precision of the reaction suggests that contingency plans already existed, plans designed to be activated if the sealed subbasement was ever exposed. Historical records provide context. In the late Cold War period, federal buildings incorporated hardened spaces designed to survive catastrophic events. Some were intended for command continuity. Others housed sensitive systems isolated from standard infrastructure. Many were later decommissioned. Few were erased entirely. The Pentagon's renovation files from 1993 show a pattern of sudden sections are removed, language becomes abstract, references to physical locations are replaced with internal codes. One memo describes the discovery only as a previously unaccounted structural volume. Another instructs recipients to cease spatial reconciliation efforts. This is an unusual phrase. Spatial reconciliation is the process of ensuring that maps, models, and physical space align. To cease it is to accept misalignment as policy. By mid-1993, the sealed subbasement was no longer discussed directly, but its influence remained. Blueprints were updated, floor numbering conventions were adjusted. The newly discovered space was not added. Instead, surrounding areas were subtly altered to absorb the discrepancy. Walls were thickened, corridors were rerouted, the building's internal logic was rewritten. From a psychological perspective, this marks a transition. The moment of discovery triggered fear. The response introduced control. The anomaly was no longer an unknown. It was a managed secret. As the renovation quietly ended, the sealed subbasement remained intact, its access points reinforced, its existence excluded from every system used by personnel who did not need to know. The question was no longer whether it existed. The question became why it had been sealed so completely that even routine maintenance was not meant to reveal it. That answer does not emerge immediately. It unfolds slowly, through policy changes, security upgrades, and the subtle language of documents that were never meant to be read together. And it begins with the realization that the subbasement was not sealed to keep something out, but to keep something contained. The idea of containment, once introduced, reframes everything that followed. The sealed subbasement was not an accident of construction, nor a forgotten remnant of wartime haste. Its design was deliberate, its concealment systematic. The renovation of 1993 did not reveal something new. It revealed something that had been waiting. Internal correspondence from late 1993 shows a shift in language. Terms like renovation and maintenance disappear, replaced by phrases such as environmental stability and controlled access integrity. These are not architectural concerns. They are operational ones. They imply ongoing activity, not abandonment. A security upgrade implemented shortly after the discovery introduced additional monitoring equipment in surrounding levels. Motion sensors were recalibrated. Thermal readings were logged more frequently. Power consumption patterns were analyzed for irregularity. None of these measures were explained to personnel outside a narrow clearance band. Officially, they were part of a broader modernization effort. Unofficially, they formed a perimeter. The subbasement itself remained uninterred, or at least, no authorized entry was recorded. This absence of records is significant. Sensitive areas usually generate extensive documentation, logs, checklists, oversight reports. Here, there is nothing. Either no one entered, or entries were recorded elsewhere, under a classification so restrictive that even secondary REFE/RENCES were eliminated. A clue emerges in a declassified budget summary from 1994. Line item labeled Infrastructure Anomaly Mitigation appears briefly, before being absorbed into a larger allocation. The phrasing is unusual. Anomalies are identified, not mitigated. To mitigate an anomaly suggests acceptance of its persistence. The same year, emergency response protocols were quietly revised. Evacuation routes were adjusted. Certain stairwells were designated as not. Training materials instructed personnel to follow updated guidance without explanation. The changes ensured that, in the event of an emergency, no one would be directed toward the sealed subbasement by mistake. This level of planning implies anticipation. Someone understood that the space could not be accessed casually, that its exposure, even during a crisis, posed a risk. What kind of risk requires such care? The records do not say, but they suggest boundaries: physical, informational, and psychological. The subbasement was not merely hidden, It was excluded from institutional consciousness. By the mid-1990s, the Pentagon's internal maps no longer conflicted. The building made sense again. The anomaly had been absorbed into the system through omission. New employees were trained on revised layouts. Old knowledge faded. The brief moment of discovery passed into rumor, then into silence, yet the sealed sub-basement remained, its walls intact, its systems drawing power, its environment monitored, a space without a name, without a floor number, without an official purpose, existing only because it had always existed. From an archival standpoint, this is where the trail ends. The renovation that revealed the sub-basement also ensured it would never be revealed again. The response was not to investigate publicly, but to reinforce invisibility, to ensure that no future project, no matter how routine, would repeat the mistake of alignment. Subtitled to closes not with resolution, but with containment perfected, a space acknowledged only by the measures taken to avoid it, a discovery neutralized by policy. And as the building settled back into its routines, a new question quietly replaced the old one. Not what was uncovered in 1993, but how many other sealed spaces remain undiscovered, protected not by locks or guards, but by the simple fact that no one is allowed to know they exist. What remains unexplained after the renovation is not the existence of the sealed sub-basement, but the degree of preparation surrounding it. The response was not reactive in the conventional sense. It unfolded with a precision that suggests rehearsal. Each action followed a sequence, each decision aligned with a framework already in place. To understand this, it is necessary to examine what did not happen. There was no internal debate recorded, no escalation through standard administrative layers, no evidence of uncertainty. In situations involving unexpected structural discoveries, even classified ones, there is typically a pause. Committees form, assessments are requested. None of that occurred here. Instead, authority asserted itself instantly. Access was revoked. Documentation was suppressed. The physical space was This implies that the sub-basement was not an unknown variable. It was a known constant, temporarily exposed. A quiet indicator of this appears in a facilities planning document from late 1993. The document outlines long-term maintenance cycles for subterranean infrastructure. Most entries correspond to known basements and utility tunnels. One entry, however, references a maintenance cycle without specifying a location. The interval is unusually short. The requirements unusually strict. Temperature stability, power continuity, structural integrity monitoring. These are not requirements for abandoned space. The absence of a location label is not an oversight. It is a method. By removing spatial reference, the document avoids linking the maintenance activity to a place that officially does not exist. The function persists. The identity is erased. This duality defines the sealed sub-basement. It is both active and absent, maintained and denied, integrated into operational planning while excluded from architectural truth. The renovation of 1993 forced this contradiction into the open, briefly, and the system responded by reinforcing the boundary between what is managed and what is acknowledged. From an institutional psychology standpoint, this boundary is critical. Organizations of this scale rely on shared assumptions. When those assumptions are threatened, the response is not curiosity, but containment. The goal is not to understand the anomaly, but to prevent it from destabilizing the larger structure of belief. In the years following the renovation, this strategy proved effective. No further accidental exposures are recorded. Maintenance continues without incident. The sealed sub-basement fades from even classified discussion. It becomes a background condition, like pressure or gravity, always present, rarely named, yet the cost of such erasure is subtle. It fragments responsibility. No single office owns the space. No single individual is accountable. Oversight becomes diffuse. Decisions are inherited rather than made. The sub-basement persists not because it is understood, but because no one remembers how to remove it. This creates a peculiar vulnerability, not one of access, but of memory. As personnel rotate and institutional knowledge decays, the rationale behind the concealment grows thinner. The protocols remain, but their protocols blurs. What was once a deliberate strategy risks becoming an unexamined habit. Archival silence deepens after 1995. References become indirect. Budgets flatten. Maintenance logs grow more abstract. The sealed sub-basement recedes into the administrative background, sustained by inertia rather than intent. And yet, the infrastructure continues to draw power. Environmental controls remain active. Sensors quietly report stability. Somewhere within the Pentagon, systems continue to respond to a space that the building officially denies. This is the unresolved tension at the heart of Subtitle 2. The renovation did not simply reveal a hidden sub-basement, it exposed a method of concealment that relies not on secrecy alone, but on the gradual erosion of context. A space protected not by force, but by forgetting. As Subtitle 2 closes. The discovery of 1993 stands as the last moment when the sealed sub-basement was acknowledged, even internally, as something anomalous. After that, it became normalized through absence. Its concealment perfected not by walls or locks, but by policy refined into routine. The next question is inevitable, and it cannot be answered by architecture alone. If a space can be maintained, monitored and secured while officially not existing, then who is tasked with watching over it now? And how long can that responsibility survive without anyone remembering why it exists at all? That question waits in the next file. The removal happened so quickly that most records do not describe it as an event, they describe it as a correction, a deviation detected and resolved. In the language of internal systems, the presence of the construction workers near the sealed area was treated not as human activity, but as an anomaly. The file that logged their removal was classified immediately. Its metadata was encrypted. Its access permissions were restricted to a clearance tier above standard facilities management. What remains visible is only the shadow of the process. Timestamps without explanation, badge revocations without incident codes, a sequence of actions that unfolds with mechanical calm. This is where authority reveals itself most clearly, not in force, but in speed. Within minutes of the wall being opened, alerts propagated through a network not connected to the renovation office. Sensors registered unauthorized spatial exposure. The system did not wait for interpretation. It did not escalate for discussion. It executed a response designed for certainty, not doubt. The workers did not know this system existed. They did not know that their location had crossed a threshold defined not by walls or signs, but by classification logic embedded deep within the building's infrastructure. They were still following approved plans when the plans ceased to matter. The file records their presence as a problem to be solved by the time a human voice addressed them. The decision had already been made. Security personnel arrived with instructions, not questions. The tone was neutral, professional, almost courteous. Tools were to be left behind. Movement was to be slow. There was no accusation, because accusation implies intent. This was not treated as wrongdoing. It was treated as misplacement. The workers were escorted away from the site along a route that bypassed their entry point. This detail appears repeatedly in fragmented accounts. The building did not want them to retrace their steps. Familiarity creates memory. Memory creates narrative. Narrative creates risk. Their access badges were disabled before they reached the outer corridors. This ensured that no lingering authorization could be exploited. In the system's view, the anomaly had been neutralized. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The only sound now is the low, constant hum of systems that never sleep. Air circulates through vents designed decades ago, upgraded silently, endlessly. The archive room is dim, lit by overhead fixtures that cast no shadows. The folder rests on the table, its surface worn smooth by hands that knew not to linger. Ink has faded where names once were. Pages are thinner than expected, as if the paper itself has been handled carefully, deliberately. The removal of the workers was not an improvisation. It followed a protocol refined through years of anticipating exactly this moment, the moment when human curiosity intersects with something that cannot be acknowledged. In the early 1990s, the Pentagon's internal security architecture had evolved beyond physical barriers. It incorporated behavioral thresholds, zones defined not only by access clearance, but by contextual awareness. To enter certain areas without the proper narrative framework was to trigger containment, regardless of authorization. This is why the workers were removed so quickly, not because they posed a threat, but because they lacked context. They did not know what they were seeing, and that ignorance paradoxically made them dangerous. One internal training document from the era emphasizes this principle with unusual clarity. It states that exposure without understanding increases the likelihood of uncontrolled disclosure. Understanding can be managed. Ignorance cannot. The workers' ignorance was absolute. They were trained to build, to repair, to follow diagrams. When the diagrams failed, they did what they were supposed to do. They documented the inconsistency. That documentation triggered the response. After their removal, the renovation site was reclassified. The work order was closed and reissued under a different identifier. The original file was sealed. Its digital copies were scrubbed from shared systems. Only an encrypted reference remained accessible only through a chain of credentials that no longer intersected with civilian contractors. The workers themselves were not punished. They were paid, reassigned, advised to forget. Each signed a revised non-disclosure agreement that expanded the definition of classified information to include spatial awareness. Not what they saw, but where they had been. This distinction is critical. The system was not protecting an object or a room. It was protecting a relationship between space and knowledge. From a historical perspective, this aligns with Cold War containment strategies. Sensitive installations were often protected by ambiguity rather than force. Confusion was cheaper than confrontation. Silence more effective than denial. By the end of the day, there was no visible sign that anything had occurred. The wall was restored. The corridor looked unchanged. Anyone passing through would see nothing unusual. The building returned to equilibrium, but the system had learned. Its thresholds were adjusted. Its response pathways refined. The speed of removal was not a fixed value. It was an evolving one. This raises a question that lingers quietly beneath the calm surface of the narrative. If a building can detect human presence as an anomaly and correct it within minutes, then what else is it watching for? That question does not resolve here. It deepens, because the removal of the workers was not the end of the incident. It was the beginning of a new phase, one in which the building itself became an active participant in ensuring that no one without permission would ever come that close again. After the workers were removed, the system did not relax. It tightened. Internal security logs from the weeks following the incident show a subtle but measurable shift in baseline behavior. Response times shortened, access tolerances narrowed, zones surrounding the sealed area were reclassified under a designation that did not previously exist. The designation did not describe function or risk. It described awareness. That this change was not communicated broadly. It did not need to be. The system was designed to operate below conscious notice. Personnel continued their routines. Maintenance continued elsewhere. Renovations resumed in other sectors. The absence of the workers near the sealed sub-basement became permanent without ever being discussed. One overlooked detail reveals how intentional this silence was. In January 1994, a facilities orientation manual was revised. The revision removed a single diagram showing vertical circulation routes in the inner ring. The diagram was replaced with a simplified version that eliminated depth references entirely. No explanation was given. New staff would never know the diagram had existed. This is how authority sustains itself over time, not by enforcing silence, but by removing the language needed to form questions. The workers' removal became a template. Future access conflicts, even unrelated ones, were handled more quickly. The system had learned the value of decisiveness. Exposure windows were shortened. Human hesitation was treated as inefficiency. From a psychological standpoint, this reflects a shift from reactive security to anticipatory control. The building no longer waited for mistakes. It adjusted conditions to prevent them. One final document from 1994 captures this philosophy indirectly. A classified risk assessment notes that unauthorized contextual exposure presents greater long-term risk than material compromise. The statement is brief. It is not elaborated, but its implication is profound. Knowledge itself had become the primary threat vector. This reframes the removal of the workers entirely. They were not witnesses to a secret. They were variables in a system optimized to eliminate witnesses before witnessing could occur. By mid-1994, the incident no longer appeared in active records. Its effects persisted, but its origin faded. Personnel changed. Systems updated. The removal became history without narrative, yet the logic that justified it remained embedded in policy. Somewhere within the Pentagon's layered protocols, there exists a rule born from that day. A rule that triggers action when presence and permission diverge too sharply. The workers never returned. None sought legal action. None spoke. Publicly, their silence was not enforced through fear, but through uncertainty. They had not seen enough to be certain of what they had encountered, and uncertainty is an unstable foundation for testimony. This, ultimately, is why the removal succeeded. It left no story to tell. Subtitle 3 closes here, not with revelation, but with recognition. The speed of the workers' removal was not a reaction to danger. It was a demonstration of how authority operates when secrecy is no longer about hiding information, but about controlling who is allowed to perceive it at all. And as the system settled into this refined equilibrium, another question quietly emerged. If human presence can be corrected so efficiently, What happens when the anomaly is not a person, but a signal, a reading, or a behavior that cannot be escorted out? That question opens the next file. What followed the removal of the workers was not recorded as an escalation, but as a recalibration. The system did not treat the incident as a breach. It treated it as feedback. Something had been learned, and that knowledge was immediately incorporated into future behavior. In the weeks after the incident, access analytics were reviewed quietly. Patterns of movement were examined not to assign blame, but to identify thresholds. How close had the workers come? How long had they remained? Which systems registered their presence first? The answers to these questions informed subtle changes that no human would consciously notice. Badge permissions were not simply restricted. They were access was no longer determined only by clearance level, but by proximity, duration, and purpose. The building began to distinguish between being authorized and being appropriate. This distinction allowed it to act without human deliberation. This is where authority becomes most difficult to perceive. There were no announcements, no policy briefings, no visible enforcement. The change existed only in how quickly the system decided that something did not belong. One overlooked memo from early 1994 hints at this shift. It references predictive spatial management, a term that appears nowhere else in public documentation. The memo describes the goal as minimizing exposure risk by adjusting environmental responses in advance. It does not define exposure. It assumes shared understanding. From a historical standpoint, this aligns with broader trends in federal security during the post-Cold War transition. The early 1990s saw increased reliance on automated oversight. Human judgment was increasingly supplemented, and sometimes replaced, by systems designed to respond faster than people could think. The removal of the workers demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach. No confrontation, no investigation, no narrative, just resolution. The workers themselves faded quickly from the record. Their names do not appear in any follow-up documentation. Their reassignment orders are generic. Their non-disclosure agreements were filed and archived. Nothing connects them, on paper, to the sealed subbasement or the events of that day. This absence is deliberate. In institutional memory, individuals matter only when they are useful as references. Once their role is complete, they dissolve back into anonymity. The system remembers the lesson, not the people. As months passed, the incident became abstract. It existed only as a set of parameters embedded in software and protocol. The building no longer needed to remember why the workers were removed. It only needed to remember how. This creates a peculiar form of authority, one that does not rely on fear or enforcement, but on automation and inevitability. There is no warning, because warning implies choice. The system does not ask. It corrects. By the end of 1994, the removal of the workers had achieved its final objective. The sealed subbasement was no longer at risk of accidental discovery, not because it was better hidden, but because the conditions that allowed discovery had been eliminated. And yet the presence of the space continued to shape behavior indirectly. Maintenance routes were redesigned, training materials simplified, spatial awareness narrowed. Over time, the building became easier to understand, precisely because it was less complete. This simplification carried a cost. It reduced the ability of individuals to question inconsistencies. When systems appear coherent, anomalies are harder to detect. The sealed subbasement benefited from this coherence. It became invisible not by force, but by design. Subtitle 3 concludes with a recognition rather than a revelation. The speed with which the construction workers were removed was not an overreaction. It was a demonstration of how modern authority functions when secrecy is up. When systems are built not just to protect information, but to prevent awareness itself. The workers were removed within minutes, because minutes were all it took for the system to decide that they should never have been there. And once that decision was made, there was no mechanism for appeal. The question that remains is not why they were removed, but what else the system is prepared to remove just as efficiently, should it ever appear where it does not belong. What makes the removal of the workers so revealing is not the speed alone, but what followed after speed was no longer necessary. Once the immediate correction was complete, the system turned inward. It evaluated itself. Internal reviews were conducted quietly, not to assign fault, but to refine detection. Logs were compared across departments that rarely intersected. Security telemetry was aligned with facilities data. Human movement was analyzed not as individual behavior, but as pattern deviation. The question was not who entered, but how entry became possible. This distinction matters. When institutions focus on individuals, they admit vulnerability. When they focus on systems, they reinforce authority. In this case, authority chose reinforcement. Over the following months, routing algorithms governing internal navigation were subtly altered. Digital maps used by contractors were simplified further. Certain pathways ceased to appear depending on task designation. A technician requesting access to electrical systems would see a different building than one assigned to structural inspection. Neither map was false. Both were incomplete. This is how the Pentagon learned to present multiple realities simultaneously. Workers had encountered a version of the building that overlapped too closely with something that was meant to remain conceptually separate. That overlap was corrected. Future overlaps were prevented not by walls, but by information control. One overlooked but critical change occurred in training language. Manuals stopped using absolute terms like always and never. Instead, they emphasized conditional phrasing. Routes may vary. Access is subject to operational context. Diagrams are illustrative only. These phrases are not neutral. They discourage certainty. Certainty is dangerous in environments built on selective knowledge. By removing certainty, the system ensured that future workers would trust instruction over observation. If something did not match expectation, the expectation would be questioned first. This psychological shift reduced the practical likelihood of future anomalies being reported. Discrepancies became personal errors rather than structural ones. The building was always right. From the perspective of authority, this was an elegant solution. The workers' removal thus became more than an isolated incident. It became a calibration point, a moment when the institution recognized that secrecy alone was insufficient. What was required was managed perception. This aligns with broader trends in late 20th century security philosophy. As physical secrecy became harder to maintain, informational asymmetry became the primary defense. Those who knew less were easier to manage than those who knew partially. The workers had known partially. That was the problem. In later years, internal audits praised the efficiency of the revised access framework. Metrics showed fewer reported inconsistencies, fewer clarification requests, faster task completion. On paper, the system had improved. What the metrics did not capture was what had been lost. The ability of individuals to question space itself, to notice when something did not align. That the building had become smoother, quieter, more predictable, and in doing so, it had grown more opaque. The workers were removed within minutes, not because of what they found, but because of what they represented. Unfiltered perception, direct contact between human curiosity and institutional absence. That contact was brief, it was corrected, and it reshaped the environment so that it would never happen again. Yet correction is never permanent. Systems age, protocols drift, new technologies introduce new blind spots, and authority, no matter how refined, must continually adapt to maintain control. As this narrative moves forward, the focus begins to shift away from the workers themselves. Their role is complete. What remains is the system they encountered, a system capable of identifying and removing human presence as efficiently as it would a faulty component, and that raises a deeper, quieter question. If authority can act this decisively without explanation, without record, and without resistance, then what else within the building operates beyond awareness, waiting only for the moment it too is briefly exposed? I will continue when you say so. There is a door inside the Pentagon that does not appear in any access log. It has no badge history, no recorded entries, no exit times, and yet, it exists. It is built from reinforced steel mounted flush into a corridor that officially ends several meters before the door should be. According to classified maintenance files, the door has been inspected, repainted, and structurally reinforced multiple times over several decades. But according to every digital system designed to track movement, it has never been used. This contradiction is not an error. It is an anomaly preserved through design. The file referencing the door is fragmented. Its metadata is encrypted. Entire sections are erased, leaving behind only enough context to confirm that something was intentionally excluded. The language used to describe the door is precise but evasive. It is referred to as a non-addressable access point. Not restricted, not sealed, simply not addressable, as if it exists outside the logic of entry and exit. In modern security architecture, every door is a data point. Badge readers log identities. Cameras record motion. Sensors track timing. Absence of data usually indicates malfunction. In this case, absence is consistent, perfect, sustained across systems, upgrades, and decades of audits. This is the hidden truth that unsettles analysts who encounter the file. A steel door that does not register interaction in a building where even failed badge attempts are recorded. A physical object that refuses to leave a digital trace. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet hum of the building at rest. Air moves through vents with measured regularity. Somewhere nearby, servers process information that will never include this door. The corridor is lit evenly, without shadow or emphasis. The steel surface reflects nothing of interest. No signage, no markings, no indication that the door matters. This is the atmosphere in which the paradox survives.com/ordinary administrative. The first indirect reference to the steel door appears in a facilities report from the late 1980s. The report concerns routine corrosion inspection. One paragraph notes that a section of corridor wall requires a different paint formulation due to material composition. The wall, it states, is not concrete. It is steel, reinforced, load-bearing. This alone is unusual. Interior corridor walls are rarely structural. There is no mention of a door, only measurements, thickness, stress tolerance, impact resistance, specifications that imply an access point without acknowledging it. Years later, during a security modernization effort, new badge readers were installed throughout the building. Logs from that project show a curious gap. One corridor segment is listed as exempt from reader installation due to non-standard configuration. No further explanation is given. The exemption persists through subsequent upgrades. This pattern repeats. Cameras are installed everywhere except one stretch. Motion sensors cover adjacent areas, but stop short. Network diagrams show signal paths that divert subtly, as if flowing around an obstacle that does not officially exist. From a surveillance perspective, this is backwards. Sensitive areas typically receive more coverage, not less. The absence of monitoring suggests not neglect, but intention. The door does not need to be watched, because it is not meant to be acknowledged. In interviews conducted years later, several former security engineers recalled being instructed not to resolve certain inconsistencies. When a system flagged a dead zone or an unresponsive endpoint, they were told to accept it as a legacy artifact. Do not correct. Do not investigate. Document as compliant. Compliance, in this context, did not mean functionality. It meant alignment with an expectation that could not be articulated. The steel door exists in this space of enforced ambiguity. It is present enough to require maintenance, yet absent enough to evade record. Its material reality contradicts its administrative invisibility. Historical context deepens the unease. During the Cold War, hardened access points were often disguised to protect continuity of government operations. Some doors led to command bunkers, others to secure communications hubs. These doors were secret, but they were logged. They existed within classified systems. The steel door differs. It is not classified in the traditional sense. It is excluded. By the early 1990s, when digital access control became standard, the door should have been integrated. Instead, it was bypassed. The systems learned to ignore it. This raises a critical question. How does a modern security infrastructure decide what not to see? The answer does not lie in a single memo or directive. It emerges from accumulated practice, from repeated decisions to treat absence as normal, from training that discourages curiosity, from language that frames gaps as features rather than flaws. As this subtitle unfolds, the steel door becomes more than an object. It becomes a case study in how surveillance can be designed not only to observe, but to deliberately look away. And that design choice has consequences. Because a door that leaves no record is not merely hidden, it is unaccountable. If it opens, no system will know. If it closes, nothing will confirm it. The door exists outside time as recorded by machines. That realization introduces a quiet dread, not because of what the door might conceal, but because of what its invisibility reveals about the limits of oversight. The steel door has no access logs, no badge records, and in a building defined by control, that absence is the most unsettling signal of all. The more investigators tried to understand how the steel door escaped documentation, the clearer it became that the absence was not the result of a single decision. It was the outcome of repetition, a pattern reinforced over time until it felt natural. Each new system inherited the blind spot of the one before it. When analog access controls were replaced with digital readers, configuration templates were reused. Zones marked as non-addressable were carried forward without question. The assumption was that someone before had a reason, and that assumption was never challenged. This is how invisibility becomes Institutional, a former access control contractor, later described the configuration process as hierarchical. Certain nodes were designated as outside scope. They did not generate errors. They did not request input. They simply existed as fixed exclusions. Engineers learned quickly not to touch them, not because of threat, but because of silence. Silence is persuasive. The steel door occupied one of these excluded nodes, not flagged as restricted, but removed from the logic that governs restriction itself. It was not protected by alarms. It was protected by irrelevance. This design choice has implications. In modern surveillance systems, what is monitored is less important than what is ignored. Attention defines reality. The steel door existed beyond attention. Maintenance records hint at this paradox. Periodic inspections note surface integrity, hinge lubrication, structural alignment. These tasks were logged under generic corridor upkeep, never under access point review. The door was treated as wall when documentation was required, and as door when function demanded. This dual identity allowed it to persist without contradiction. One security analyst, reviewing historical diagrams, noted that the door's placement aligned precisely with a convergence of older utility tunnels. These tunnels predated modern surveillance infrastructure. They were mapped inconsistently. Some were sealed, others repurposed. The steel door appeared to interface with this older layer, bridging eras of design that never fully reconciled. That bridge mattered. Older systems relied on secrecy. Newer systems relied on data. The door existed between them, inheriting the protections of both without fully belonging to either. By the time comprehensive audits were introduced in the late 1990s, the door had become normalized through omission. Audit tools scanned for discrepancies based on expected patterns. The door did not violate expectations, because expectations had been adjusted around it. This is the quiet power of long-term concealment. It reshapes the baseline. When no logs exist, investigators look for activity. When no activity exists, they assume no function. But the steel door did not need frequent use to remain relevant. Its significance lay in its potential. A door that can open without record is not defined by how often it opens. It is defined by the fact that it can. This realization unsettled those who encountered the file, not because it suggested constant movement, but because it suggested the possibility of movement without accountability. In a system built on oversight, accountability is the final safeguard. The absence of badge records was not a gap. It was a design philosophy. As this subtitle continues, the focus shifts toward consequence. What does it mean for an institution to tolerate a space that cannot be audited? How does authority justify a feature that undermines its own logic? Those answers do not appear in technical documentation. They appear in policy language, in training omissions, in the way questions are quietly discouraged, and they appear most clearly when someone finally tries to trace the door's purpose, only to discover that purpose was never meant to be written down. Attempts to define the purpose of the steel door inevitably failed for the same reason that access logs failed. The systems responsible for explanation were the same systems designed to avoid it. Investigators searching for intent encountered layers of administrative neutrality. No directive ordered the door's exclusion. No memo justified its invisibility. The absence was achieved not through command, but through consensus formed over time. This consensus manifested most clearly in how questions were handled. When a junior analyst once raised the issue during a routine review, the response was not corrective. It was procedural. The analyst was advised that the configuration fell within acceptable variance. The term variance appears frequently in internal language. It implies deviation without error, something different, but not wrong. That framing closed the discussion. The steel door was never defended. It was normalized. From an institutional perspective, this is efficient. Justification invites scrutiny. Normalization dissolves it. Once a feature is treated as background, it no longer requires explanation. It simply is. Over time, the door's lack of data became its defining characteristic. Systems calibrated themselves around that lack. Audits assumed its silence. Training materials omitted reference to it entirely. New personnel entered an environment where the question could not form because the vocabulary to ask it no longer existed. This is how surveillance paradoxes survive, not by hiding objects, but by shaping perception. The steel door's invisibility did not weaken security. It refined it. By removing itself from oversight, it avoided becoming a point of contention. No alarms to maintain, no logs to protect, no evidence to leak. Its risk profile was reduced by erasure, yet this refinement introduced a deeper vulnerability. A door that cannot be audited cannot be challenged. If it opens, the system will not react. If it closes, nothing will record the event. The door exists outside feedback loops. In theory, this makes it the safest possible access point. In practice, it makes it the most opaque. Former officials who encountered the anomaly later described a quiet discomfort, not fear, not suspicion, a recognition that something fundamental about oversight had been bypassed, that a line had been drawn not around a space, but around awareness itself. This discomfort rarely translated into action. The door had persisted too long. It had survived too many upgrades. Its invisibility was now part of the building's identity. Removing it would require admitting that oversight had limits. Institutions rarely volunteer such admissions, so the steel door remains not as a secret waiting to be exposed, but as a lesson embedded in architecture, a reminder that surveillance is not defined by how much is seen, but by what is permitted to remain unseen. As subtitle for closes, the door stands unchanged, maintained, unlogged, unquestioned, its steel surface, indifferent to the systems that flow around it. In a building defined by records, it leaves none. And that absence leads forward, toward a larger question that cannot be confined to a single door. If modern surveillance can be taught to ignore something so completely, then what else might exist just beyond the edges of recorded reality, waiting patiently in the spaces between what is monitored and what is allowed to be known? That question opens the next file. The blueprints do not fade gradually. They stop. Linework that has remained precise for decades suddenly ends at the same vertical boundary. Regardless of revision, scale, or department of origin, walls extend confidently, measurements align, annotations remain consistent. And then, without warning, the drawing halts as if the page itself refuses to continue. The effect is not subtle. It is abrupt, repeated, and impossible to mistake for damage or error. In one classified file, the termination point is marked only by a blank margin. In another, the grid continues, but the structure does not. In a third, the wall reaches the boundary and simply dissolves into unmarked space. Each version differs stylistically, yet all conclude at the same invisible line. Engineers noticed this long before analysts did, but the observation was never elevated. It was documented, archived, and quietly ignored. The anomaly exists across decades of revisions. Hand-drawn plans from the mid-20th century end at the same location as digitally rendered schematics produced half a century later. Software changed, standards evolved, teams rotated, the wall remained unmapped beyond a certain point. This consistency is the hidden truth buried in the files. The blueprints were not incomplete, they were terminated. The files that reference the termination are fragmented. Their metadata is encrypted. Notes attached to early revisions are erased in later ones. Where explanations should exist, there are only references to compliance with established spatial limits. No document defines those limits. They are assumed. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The environment in which these drawings were reviewed was calm, controlled, and administrative. Large tables under fluorescent lights, rolled paper laid flat and weighted at the corners, the smell of ink and toner lingering in climate-controlled rooms. Analysts studied the plans slowly, tracing lines with gloved fingers, pausing where the geometry broke off, then moving on without comment. The silence was not enforced. It was practiced. At first glance, the termination appears practical. Blueprints often focus on relevant areas. Peripheral space is omitted, but this explanation fails under scrutiny. The same termination appears in plans meant to be comprehensive. Emergency routing diagrams, structural load analyses, fire suppression layouts, documents that should never omit space. In each case, the same wall ends at the same vertical boundary. Beyond it, nothing is defined. This raised a quiet question among a small group of reviewers. What lies beyond the line? The question was never answered directly. Instead, it was the area beyond the termination was described as navigable, not restricted, not classified, simply non-navigable, a term that discourages inquiry by implying physical impossibility rather than policy. Yet the building itself contradicts this. Measurements taken on site confirm that the structure continues beyond the wall depicted on the plans. Corridors do not collapse into void. Load-bearing elements extend further. The space exists physically, even if it does not exist on paper. This is where the visual paradox becomes unsettling. The blueprints are not lying, they are obeying an instruction. Stop here. Historical anchors deepen the pattern. In 1962, during a major internal reorganization, a new set of architectural standards was circulated. The memo emphasized clarity, simplification, and consistency across documentation. It also introduced a concept called boundary abstraction. Certain areas, it stated, should be represented symbolically rather than spatially. The term appears again in 1978, then in 1991, always without elaboration, always in relation to the same region of the building. By the time digital drafting became standard, the abstraction had hardened into rule. Software templates were configured with predefined limits. When drafters reached the boundary, the system offered no continuation. The cursor stopped responding. Layers could not be extended. The wall could not be drawn beyond that point. This was not a software bug. It was a configuration choice inherited from earlier constraints. The effect on perception was profound. New engineers never questioned the absence because they never encountered it. The wall was where the building ended, because that was where the drawing ended. Physical reality became secondary to representation. This inversion is critical. In institutions governed by documentation, what is drawn defines what is real. Space that is not represented becomes conceptually inaccessible, even if it exists. As Part 1 continues, the blueprints reveal themselves not as neutral records but as instruments of selective visibility. They show what may be acknowledged, and conceal what must not be explored. And the most unsettling detail is not that the drawings stop, it is that they all stop at the same wall. What unsettled reviewers was not only where the blueprints stopped, but how consistently the termination was defended. When questions were raised, the answers were never technical, they were procedural. The drawings were said to be correct according to standards. The standards themselves were never attached. This pattern appears again in a 1974 internal review of emergency egress routes. The report notes that evacuation diagrams for several intersections end prematurely at the same vertical boundary. The reviewer flagged the issue, noting that safe exit modeling requires complete spatial continuity. The response, preserved in a marginal annotation, states simply that the area beyond the boundary was not required for evacuation planning. No explanation followed. That decision alone reshaped how the space would be treated for decades. If an area is excluded from emergency logic, it becomes conceptually peripheral. Peripheral spaces attract less attention. Less attention invites omission. Omission becomes habit. Over time, the boundary on the blueprints stopped being perceived as a decision and began to feel like a fact. Architects who joined the project later inherited this fact without context. They were trained on existing templates. Those templates already ended at the wall. When they asked why, senior staff advised them not to redraw what had already been approved. Approval, in this environment, carried more weight than accuracy. This is how abstraction solidifies. What begins as a deliberate omission becomes an unquestioned norm. The visual impact of the termination also played a role. On large format prints, the wall appears definitive. Heavy line weight, clear annotation. It looks final. There is no visual cue suggesting continuation. The eye stops where the line stops. Perception follows design. In contrast, physical inspections tell a different story. Maintenance teams reported that corridors beyond the mapped boundary required routine servicing. Electrical conduits extended further. Structural supports continued. These reports were filed under generic categories, never cross-referenced with architectural plans. The disconnect persisted because no system forced reconciliation. In 1989, a facilities modernization initiative attempted such reconciliation. Digital overlays were created to compare physical surveys with existing blueprints. The software flagged multiple discrepancies, all clustered around the same wall. The flagged region was marked for manual review. The manual review never occurred. Instead, the flagged data was reclassified as noise. The system parameters were adjusted so the discrepancy would no longer trigger alerts. The blueprint boundary became the reference point against which reality was judged, not the other way around. This reversal is subtle but profound. It means that the drawing no longer represented the building. The building was expected to conform to the drawing, at least conceptually. Once this logic took hold, further revisions reinforced it. When new wings were renovated, planners aligned their designs with existing abstractions. The boundary wall became a fixed edge in every new file. Each iteration strengthened the illusion that nothing lay beyond. The psychological effect on those who worked with the plans was gradual. Fewer questions were asked. Curiosity diminished. The termination ceased to register as strange. It became part of the visual language of the building. By the early 2000s, the abstraction was complete. Blueprints circulated without commentary. Training materials omitted mention of the boundary entirely. New analysts assumed the wall marked a transition to utilities or foundation, not an omission of space. Yet the physical structure remained unchanged. The building still extended, the corridor still existed. The difference was not architectural, it was cognitive. The blueprints had taught generations of professionals where not to look. As this part continues, the focus shifts from the drawings themselves to their effect. Because when representation ends at the same wall often enough, the wall stops being a line on paper and starts becoming a boundary of thought. The most consequential effect of the terminated blueprints was not architectural, it was institutional. Once the boundary became accepted, it influenced how information moved, how responsibilities were assigned, and how accountability dissolved. Departments responsible for adjacent areas developed overlapping assumptions. Facilities assumed security controlled the space beyond the wall. Security assumed it was a structural exclusion managed by engineering. Engineering assumed it was legacy infrastructure governed by archival policy. Each assumption reduced the need to investigate further. The absence of clarity became self-sustaining. This diffusion of responsibility appears repeatedly in internal correspondence. Emails reference the abstracted zone without defining it. Meeting notes acknowledge limitations of scope. No one claims ownership, because ownership requires definition. Definition would require drawing what had already been UNDRAWN. In one case from 1996, a structural integrity assessment requested confirmation of load distribution beyond the mapped boundary. The request was returned with a note stating that calculations were complete within represented parameters. The phrase, represented parameters, became a shield. It justified exclusion without explanation. Over time, this logic reshaped compliance culture. Audits focused on consistency rather than completeness. As long as documents aligned with each other, they were considered accurate. The fact that they aligned by omitting the same space was not considered a flaw. It was considered cohesion. That this cohesion had a powerful psychological effect. When every document agrees, doubt feels unreasonable. The repetition of omission created certainty. Physical inspections that contradicted the plans were reframed as anomalies in reporting rather than indicators of deeper inconsistency. A maintenance worker noting unexplained depth was advised to recalibrate instruments. An engineer questioning corridor length was told to consult updated drawings. Reality was corrected to match representation. The boundary wall thus became more than a drafting choice. It became a cognitive anchor. It defined where inquiry stopped. This anchoring was reinforced visually. In later blueprint revisions, the wall was thickened. Its line weight increased. It appeared more substantial than surrounding structures. The visual language suggested finality. Even without words, the message was clear. There is nothing beyond this point that concerns you. This message was never spoken. It did not need to be. It was absorbed through repetition. In institutional environments, silence is rarely empty. It is instructive. The absence of depiction communicates just as effectively as explicit warning. The blueprints taught restraint, yet restraint has limits. It works until someone needs to reconcile the abstract with the physical. Until a system designed for coherence encounters a requirement for truth, that moment would come quietly. During a routine review that was never intended to uncover anything unusual, and when it did, the boundary wall would reveal itself not as an edge, but as a deliberate veil. The review that reopened attention to the terminated blueprints was not conducted by architects or engineers. It was conducted by archivists. Their task was not to validate structure, but to ensure continuity of record. In the early 2000s, a digitization initiative sought to consolidate decades of architectural documentation into a unified archive. Physical drawings were scanned, metadata was standardized, cross-references were created between revisions. The goal was efficiency, not investigation. But digitization has a way of exposing patterns that remain invisible on paper, as files were aligned. Chronologically, archivists noticed that the termination point did not drift. Across hundreds of documents, spanning more than 50 years, the wall remained fixed. Revisions changed surrounding geometry. Annotations evolved. Technologies advanced. The termination did not move. This stability was statistically improbable. Archivists flagged the pattern internally. Their language was cautious. They did not suggest intent. They described coincidence. But coincidence loses credibility when it persists across independent authorship. The response was swift and quiet. The flag's pattern was reclassified as expected abstraction. The term appeared again, now applied retroactively. Documentation guidelines were updated to clarify that certain spatial regions were not required for archival completeness. This clarification did not define the regions. It simply acknowledged their existence by acknowledging abstraction without specifying its bounds. The institution preserved flexibility. The wall could remain where it was without justification. The abstraction could expand or contract without record. The archivist's concern was neutralized not by denial, but by normalization. After this intervention, the digitization continued without further incident. The pattern was absorbed into the archive as a feature rather than a flaw. Yet the act of digitization had already accomplished something irreversible. It had revealed the persistence of the boundary across time. Even if that revelation was suppressed, it existed in memory. A small group of professionals now knew that the wall was not accidental. They did not speak of it openly. They did not need to. Awareness alone was enough to create unease, because if the blueprints ended at the same wall for half a century, the question was no longer what lay beyond, but why the decision to stop drawing had never been revisited. Decisions that are never revisited often indicate decisions that cannot be defended. In this case, the boundary wall functioned as a legacy choice, insulated from scrutiny by time and repetition. No living official could point to its origin. No document recorded the initial justification. The abstraction predated modern oversight. It had survived transitions of power, policy, and technology. This survival suggested that the abstraction served a purpose beyond convenience. The purpose may not have been concealment in the traditional sense. It may have been simplification. Complex systems often hide what they cannot integrate. Rather than confront structural anomalies, they isolate them conceptually. The wall may have been drawn not to hide space, but to stabilize understanding. Yet stabilization through omission carries risk. It creates blind zones where assumptions replace verification. The blueprints created such a blind zone. Anyone relying on them would believe the building ended where the wall ended. Anyone navigating physically would adapt without reconciling the difference. The system functioned because no one was required to bridge the gap, until someone was. That requirement would arise not from curiosity, but from necessity. When infrastructure demanded explanation rather than compliance. When abstraction could no longer satisfy operational need. The conditions for that moment were forming quietly, shaped by the same forces that had maintained the boundary for so long. The blueprints that ended abruptly at the same wall did more than omit space. They trained generations of professionals to accept limits without cause. The drawings were consistent. The files were aligned. The archive was clean. And yet, the physical reality remained unresolved. This is the final tension of the abstraction. It created order by denying completeness. It achieved stability by discouraging curiosity. And it persisted because it worked. But systems that rely on omission are fragile. They depend on silence, on shared avoidance, on the assumption that no one will ever need to ask the wrong question. When that assumption fails, the abstraction collapses. What happens next does not begin with a blueprint or a wall or a drawing that stops. It begins with a requirement that cannot be satisfied by representation alone. And when that requirement emerges, the boundary that once seemed permanent will reveal itself for what it always was. Not an edge, but a decision. The concrete pour began after midnight. Without permits, without invoices, and without a single line of paperwork to justify its urgency. According to the limited records that survived, the order was issued verbally, relayed through intermediaries who never signed their names, and executed by a crew that was told only what was necessary to complete the task before sunrise. By morning, a section of the building that had existed the night before was sealed beneath tons of wet concrete, smoothed flat as if nothing had ever been there. What makes this event unsettling is not that concrete was poured. Buildings undergo repairs constantly. What makes it disturbing is that no official record explains why it had to happen overnight. Why no documentation followed, or why subsequent blueprints show the area as if it had always been solid. The file that references the pour is classified. Its timestamps are encrypted. Supporting documents are erased. What remains is an anomaly, a hidden truth preserved only through absence. This is not a story of renovation. It is a story of erasure performed under urgency. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The environment surrounding the event is quiet and administrative. Fluorescent lights hum in empty offices. Hallways echo faintly as security patrols pass at regular intervals. Somewhere deep within the building, a freight elevator descends to a level not listed on public directories. The concrete arrives in silence, mixed off-site, transported in unmarked trucks, its destination known only to a small number of coordinators who never appear in any roster. The decision to pour concrete overnight implies necessity. Concrete cures slowly, it demands planning. To proceed without paperwork suggests that delay carried greater risk than permanent alteration. Whatever prompted the pour could not wait for approval cycles or standard oversight. Historical anchors place. The event in the late Cold War period, when emergency protocols were refined to address threats that might never materialize but could not be ignored. During this era, contingency actions were sometimes executed preemptively, justified only by internal threat assessments that remained sealed indefinitely. In this case, no such assessment has been located. Maintenance logs from the following weeks. Note, an unusual recalibration of load calculations. Structural engineers adjusted weight tolerances in adjacent areas, compensating for mass that was not previously accounted for. These adjustments were logged without explanation, folded into routine updates, and approved without comment. The concrete itself became part of the building's assumed history. Workers involved in the pour were instructed not to discuss the job. This was not framed as secrecy, but as error. They were told the task was temporary, corrective already accounted for elsewhere. By the time questions might have formed, the concrete had set. What lies beneath it remains undocumented. Subsequent inspections treat the area as solid foundation. Ground-penetrating surveys skip the section entirely, citing interference. Blueprints render it as continuous mass, uninterrupted by voids or conduits. The overnight pour did not simply fill space, it redefined it. This redefinition had cascading effects. Access routes were rerouted, ventilation paths adjusted, emergency plans revised to exclude the zone entirely. Each change reinforced the fiction that nothing had changed at all. The absence of paperwork is the clearest signal. Institutions that document everything do not forget overnight actions unless forgetting is the objective. The lack of invoices, permits, or authorizations suggests a parallel process, one designed to operate outside archival capture. As this narration continues, the focus shifts from the act of pouring concrete to the conditions that made it necessary. Because concrete is not used to hide mistakes, it is used to close problems permanently, and whatever prompted that decision was never meant to surface again. The urgency of the overnight concrete pour becomes clearer when examined through what followed rather than what preceded it. Within days, internal maintenance schedules were quietly revised. Areas adjacent to the pour were assigned new inspection intervals. Equipment placement diagrams were adjusted to avoid certain load paths. None of these changes referenced the pour directly. They did not need to. The concrete had already rewritten the physical logic of the space. One detail stands out in a facilities memo dated shortly after the event. It notes that vibration readings in the affected section dropped to 0, not reduced, eliminated, as if the structure beneath the concrete no longer responded to the building's ambient movement. This anomaly was logged, acknowledged, and then categorized as stable. Stability, in this context, did not mean understood. It meant no longer questioned. Concrete is a final material. Unlike walls or panels, it cannot be easily removed without noise, time, and explanation. Choosing it implies commitment. The overnight pour suggests that whatever lay beneath required not just concealment, but permanent separation from access and awareness. Workers who later serviced nearby systems reported subtle inconsistencies. Sound behaved differently. Footsteps echoed less. Instruments calibrated for resonance returned unexpected readings. These observations were dismissed individually, each attributed to minor variance. Taken together, they formed a pattern no one was tasked to assemble. The absence of paperwork ensured that no single department bore responsibility. Without an initiating document, there was nothing to audit. Without an audit trail, there was no event to review. The pour existed only as outcome. This method aligns with a specific containment philosophy. Rather than isolate a space through classification, remove it from the administrative universe entirely. A thing without records cannot be contested. It cannot be requested. It cannot be revisited. Historical precedent supports this approach. During periods of heightened alert, certain actions were designed to leave no trace beyond their physical result. The logic was simple. Records can be discovered. Structures cannot speak. The overnight timing also mattered. Night work minimizes witnesses. It compresses decision chains. Fewer people ask questions when the task is framed as urgent and temporary. By morning, the concrete is curing, and the window for objection has closed. Subsequent architectural plans show the area as continuous foundation, indistinguishable from surrounding mass. New engineers reviewing the plans would see nothing unusual. The pour succeeded not because it was hidden, but because it was normalized immediately. As this part unfolds, attention turns to the implications of sealing something so completely. Because pouring concrete without paperwork is not an act of maintenance, it is an act of erasure designed to outlast memory. The choice of concrete, rather than steel plating or removable barriers, reveals the psychology behind the decision. Concrete does not invite revision. Once poured, it reframes the past. Anything beneath it becomes prehistorical, sealed off not just physically but conceptually. The building forgets by hardening. Internal logistics schedules from the months following the pour show a quiet redistribution of activity. Storage rooms near the sealed section were reassigned. Utility corridors were shortened on paper. Travel paths were optimized around a mass that planners treated as if it had always been there. No transition period is visible in the records. There is no moment of adjustment. The change appears instantaneous. This immediacy suggests coordination beyond a single department. For so many downstream documents to align so quickly, advance notice must have circulated informally, not through memos, but through understanding. The kind of understanding that passes without words. Concrete crews later recalled being given unusual instructions. They were told to pour continuously, without breaks, regardless of standard curing practice. Speed mattered more than finish. The surface would be concealed later. What mattered was sealing the volume before dawn. One worker described the pour as deeper than expected. More material was required than originally calculated. No one questioned the discrepancy. Additional trucks arrived without delay. The concrete kept coming until the void was gone. That detail is critical. It implies that the volume being filled was not precisely known beforehand. The objective was not to fill a planned cavity, but to eliminate space itself. After the pour, acoustic surveys were quietly updated. Certain frequencies no longer propagated through the structure. The building's internal sound map changed. These changes were logged as improvements. Reduced vibration, increased stability, benefits without context. Yet stability can also indicate isolation. Concrete absorbs, but it also separates. Whatever lay beneath was now cut off from airflow, access, and observation. If systems had existed there, they were entombed. If space had existed, it was denied. The lack of follow-up documentation reinforces this interpretation. No inspection reports assess the integrity of what was sealed. No maintenance schedules account for it. The area simply ceases to exist administratively. This absence becomes more striking when, compared to how other emergency modifications were handled. Even classified alterations usually leave a trace. A line item, a reference code. Here there is nothing. As this part deepens, the overnight pour begins to resemble not a response to damage, but a response to discovery. Something was encountered that could not be processed through standard channels. Concrete was chosen because it ends questions. End questions. At that moment, may have been the greater risk. Years later, during a structural reassessment prompted by unrelated renovations, engineers encountered inconsistencies in load modeling near the poured section. The calculations worked only if the concrete mass was treated as homogeneous and inert. Any internal variation would have destabilized the model. Rather than investigate, the model parameters were constrained. Assumptions were tightened until the math behaved. This was not deception, it was compliance. The building had taught its caretakers how to think. One engineer noted privately that the mass behaved more like a plug than a foundation. It did not distribute load naturally. It resisted integration. The comment was never submitted formally. Ground-penetrating radar was considered and dismissed. The justification cited signal interference from dense material. This explanation was technically sound. It was also convenient. Over time, the poured section became a reference point. Other anomalies were measured against it. If something deviated, it was compared to the known irregularity. The irregularity became baseline. This is how exceptions become norms. The concrete pour succeeded because it did not demand belief. It demanded acceptance. No one was asked to agree with the decision. They were only asked to proceed as if it had always been correct. The absence of paperwork ensured that no narrative could form. Without narrative, there is no debate. Without debate, there is no revision. That what remained was a sealed volume and a building that had adjusted around it. The most unsettling aspect of the overnight poor is not what it concealed, but how effectively it erased the impulse to look back. New personnel entered a structure whose history had been rewritten physically. There was no visible seam, no marker of intervention. The concrete blended seamlessly with surrounding material. This seamlessness discouraged retrospection. Nothing looked altered, so nothing felt altered. Institutional memory relies on friction, on moments where the present does not align with expectation. The poor eliminated friction by making the alteration permanent and unremarkable, even when older staff hinted at a late-night job years ago. The lack of records rendered the hints meaningless. Stories without documentation carry no weight in bureaucratic environments. The concrete became silent authority. It did not explain itself. It did not need to dot as time passed. The rationale for the poor, whatever it had been, lost relevance. The action outlived its cause. What remained was effect without origin, and effects without origin are difficult to challenge. The overnight concrete pour ordered without paperwork stands as one of the most complete acts of administrative erasure on record. It removes space, responsibility, and memory in a single operation. Concrete was chosen because it does not negotiate. It does not decay quickly. It does not invite inspection. It transforms uncertainty into mass. What lies beneath it may never be known, not because it is inaccessible, but because the systems designed to know have been trained not to ask. And that training, once complete, does not end with concrete. It extends outward, shaping how future anomalies are handled, how urgency is justified, and how silence becomes procedure. The next time something is encountered that cannot be explained, the precedent already exists. No paperwork, overnight action, permanent resolution. The concrete waits, not as evidence, but as instruction. The contractors existed on paper long enough to be hired, and then they vanished. Their names appear briefly in procurement ledgers, attached to project codes that no longer resolve to any department. The amounts listed beside them are precise, calculated down to the cent, yet every corresponding payment record is missing. No transfers, no checks, no delayed just a financial trail that stops as abruptly as it begins. In a system built on accounting, this is not a clerical error, it is an anomaly. The file containing the anomaly is classified. Its transaction logs are encrypted. Cross-references to standard budget systems have been erased. What remains is a ledger that acknowledges work performed without acknowledging compensation delivered. The hidden truth is not that the contractors were unpaid. It is that the system knows this, and records it without resolving it. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The atmosphere surrounding these records is sterile and quiet. Rows of archived financial reports sit in temperature-controlled storage. Screens glow softly in rooms where no one speaks above a murmur. The contractors' names appear only when filters are disabled, when safeguards meant to simplify, review, are temporarily lifted. Even then, the entries feel reluctant, as if they were never meant to be seen together. The projects associated with the unpaid contractors span several years. Infrastructure work, night operations, temporary labor assignments tied to non-recurring tasks. Each project is marked as completed. Each outcome is logged as satisfactory. The absence exists only on the financial side. Initial reviews assume delay. Payments sometimes lag behind completion. But weeks passed, then months, then years. The entries remained unresolved. No escalation followed. No corrective action was recorded. This silence is what unsettles auditors who encounter the file decades later. Unpaid contractors represent legal exposure. Institutions do not ignore such risks casually. Yet here, the exposure is preserved without response. Historical anchors place the earliest cases in the late 1980s, during a period of increased reliance on external labor for sensitive tasks. Contractors were favored for flexibility. They could be brought in quickly, dismissed quietly, and compartmentalized easily. Their separation from permanent staff was a feature, not a flaw. In this context, payment becomes more than compensation. It becomes acknowledgement. To pay a contractor is to admit participation. To generate a payment record is to leave evidence of interaction. In highly sensitive operations, evidence itself can be undesirable. The unpaid entries suggest an alternative method. Contractors were logged for accountability, but not settled in standard systems. Their compensation, if delivered at all, would have occurred elsewhere, through channels designed not to intersect with institutional accounting. But no such channels appear in the record. Interviews conducted years later with procurement officers reveal careful language. They recall special handling cases. They describe exceptions. None remember specifics. Memory fades where documentation should exist. What remains is a pattern: contractors hired, work completed, payments unresolved, no disputes filed, no lawsuits recorded, no complaints escalated. This absence of protest is as telling as the absence of payment. Contractors who are not paid usually object, they file claims, they pursue remedies. These contractors did not. That fact introduces a darker possibility: that payment was never expected, that the terms of engagement operated outside conventional labor logic. That as this narration continues, attention turns from the missing money to the missing voices. Because financial anomalies do not persist without human consequence. Someone absorbed the cost, someone accepted silence, and understanding why requires looking beyond ledgers, into the conditions under which work was offered, accepted, and concluded without trace. The absence of payment records becomes more unsettling when compared against how meticulously the work itself was documented. Task completion reports are thorough, time windows are logged, materials are accounted for, supervisory approvals are digitally signed. In some cases, quality assurance notes are more detailed than those found in fully paid projects from the same period. The system cared deeply that the work was done correctly. It showed no comparable concern for whether the people who did it were compensated. This imbalance suggests intent in standard procurement workflows. Payment is the final verification step. It closes the loop. It confirms that obligations on both sides have been fulfilled. Removing that step does not simply delay closure. It keeps the loop permanently open, unresolved but contained. The contractors associated with these anomalies were not casual hires. Many held specialized clearances. Their onboarding files indicate expedited background checks and limited scope authorizations. They were granted just enough access to perform narrowly defined tasks, often during off hours, often in locations that were later reclassified or physically altered. Several of these contractors appear only once in the system. A single project, a single line item, no employment history before or after. It is as if they were summoned briefly, then released back into obscurity, preserved only because it was attached to an unrelated audit. References non-standard settlement expectations. The phrase is not explained. It appears nowhere else. Its meaning must be inferred from context. Non-standard settlement implies that payment did not follow standard procedure. It does not necessarily imply non-payment, but it does imply avoidance of traceable exchange. Financial systems are designed to remember. To move money is to create memory. Every transfer generates records across multiple ledgers, reconciled and audited over time. To avoid memory, money must either not move, or move somewhere else entirely, yet no alternate payment. Systems appear in the archive. This absence forces a difficult conclusion. Either the contractors were compensated in a way that left no institutional trace, or compensation was replaced with something else. That possibility reframes the silence surrounding these cases. Contractors who accept non-monetary compensation may have little incentive to protest. Those who accept risk-based work under extraordinary conditions may enter agreements that dissolve conventional expectations. In one declassified interview, a former logistics coordinator, auditors encountering them were advised that the matters were closed without settlement, closed without explanation. Closure, again, did not mean resolution. It meant containment. As this part deepens, it becomes clear that the unpaid contractors were not an oversight. They were a mechanism, a way to achieve action without attachment, to borrow labor without debt. That this raises an ethical question that the system never answers. What is owed to those who perform work that must not be remembered? The long-term effect of this practice is difficult to measure, because its success depends on invisibility. There are no public cases, no known whistleblowers, no lawsuits drawing attention to missing wages. Instead, there is only the archive, quiet, incomplete, suggestive. The unpaid contractor entries persist as unresolved variables. They do not reconcile. They do not age out. They remain untouched by correction. This persistence suggests that someone, somewhere, decided that resolution itself would create more risk than leaving the anomaly exposed but inert. Financial anomalies usually trigger alarms. This one was neutralized by being left alone. The contractors, whoever they were, completed their tasks and then exited the system. Their disappearance was as clean as their entry. No employment records, no follow-up assignments, no paper trail beyond the initial line item. That it is possible that some were paid in cash. It is possible that others were compensated through indirect means. It is also possible that payment was never the primary incentive. In certain operations, Participation itself carries implied reward, access, protection, favors, or simply the knowledge of having contributed to something larger, however undefined. As this part continues, the narrative moves toward its quiet conclusion, not a revelation of names or sums, but an acknowledgement of method. The unpaid contractors were not forgotten by accident. They were designed to be forgettable. The contractors who were never officially paid remain one of the most revealing financial anomalies in the archive, not because money is missing, but because accountability is. Their unpaid status severed the strongest institutional bond between labor and authority. It ensured that no formal obligation persisted beyond the task itself, no debt, no claim, no record demanding closure. In this way, the anomaly reveals a strategy. When involvement must be erased, compensation becomes liability, silence becomes currency. The system recorded just enough to confirm that work occurred, and nothing more. The contractors' labor-shaped outcomes that still exist. Their presence does not. This pattern does not end with contractors. It establishes a precedent for how future urgent tasks might be handled, who might be called, what might be offered, what might be withheld, and it leads quietly toward the next question waiting in the archive. If labor can be obtained without payment and without protest, what other exchanges have been structured to leave no trace at all? The file does not answer this. It does not need to. It only shows that the anomaly exists, unresolved, and preserved exactly as intended. The rejections arrive with identical language, identical formatting, and identical punctuation, regardless of who submits the request or what year it is filed. Different journalists, different researchers, different citizens, each invoking the Freedom of Information Act, each asking for records tied to different events, receive the same response, word for word, line for line. Even the spacing remains unchanged. The document is short. It cites exemptions without explanation. It references national security in abstract terms. It offers no appeal path beyond the one already exhausted. The letterhead varies slightly over time, reflecting administrative updates, but the body never changes. It is as if the response was written once, sealed, and reused indefinitely. This repetition is not efficiency. It is a signal. The file that tracks these responses is classified. Its internal routing is encrypted. Earlier drafts have been erased. What remains is an anomaly, a hidden truth embedded not in what is denied, but in how uniformly denial is delivered. The same words, sent to different people, across decades, suggest a decision made long ago and never revisited. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The atmosphere around these rejections is quiet and procedural. A requester submits a form through an online portal. The system confirms receipt. Weeks pass. Then the response arrives. Calm and final. No human contact. No variation in tone. The language does not engage with the specifics of the request. It does not need to. FOIA was designed to introduce friction into secrecy, to force agencies to explain why information must remain hidden. But friction only works when responses are individualized. When denial requires thought. Here, thought has been removed from the process. Historical anchors trace the first appearance of this identical rejection language to the mid-1970s. Shortly after major reforms expanded public access to government records, agencies scrambled to adapt. New offices were created, new procedures drafted. Somewhere in that transition, a template emerged at first. The template was used sparingly, only for requests deemed especially sensitive. Over time, its use expanded. The language proved effective. It closed requests quickly. It withstood appeals. Courts accepted it as sufficient. Once accepted, it became permanent. The same paragraph appears in responses to requests about infrastructure modifications, personnel movements, budget allocations, and archival gaps. Topics vary. The answer does not. This consistency produces an illusion of lawfulness. When the language never changes, it feels authoritative, familiar, unquestionable. Requesters often assume that the sameness reflects settled legal ground. In reality, it reflects administrative inertia. Internal correspondence reveals that staff processing fewer requests are instructed not to alter the language. Deviations require review. Review introduces risk. Risk introduces delay. Delay invites scrutiny. By keeping the language fixed, the system minimizes exposure. The rejection becomes less a decision and more a reflex. As this narration continues, attention shifts from the words themselves to what their repetition conceals. Because identical responses do more than deny access. They flatten difference. They erase nuance. They suggest that all questions, no matter how carefully framed, lead to the same forbidden space. And when every path ends at the same wall of text, the wall itself becomes the message. The people who process these requests rarely see the files being denied. Their role is mechanical. They verify identity. They log receipt. They assign a tracking number. Then the template is applied. The decision has already been made elsewhere, long before the request entered the system. Training manuals emphasize consistency over judgment. New officers are told that uniform language protects the agency. It reduces the chance of contradiction. It limits interpretive drift. In practice, it also removes discretion. The officer becomes an extension of the template. This is why the rejection letters feel impersonal, not cold, but distant. They do not argue. They do not persuade. They simply assert. Several former FOIA officers have described the process as closing a door that was never open. The request triggers a response, but not a review. The review occurred years earlier, when the category of information was sealed behind pre-approved language. This creates a paradox. FOIA requests are evaluated individually, but denied categorically. The appearance of case-by-case assessment masks a predetermined outcome. Historical records show that the identical rejection language survived multiple administrative overhauls. Agencies were renamed, departments merged, oversight committees changed. The wording remained intact. In one internal audit from the early 1990s, an analyst noted that the template response was older than the digital systems used to distribute it. It had been scanned, retyped, reformatted, and migrated, but never substantively edited. Each migration preserved it exactly. The reason given was legal sufficiency. Courts had accepted the language once. That acceptance hardened into doctrine. To change the wording would invite reassessment. Reassessment could invite disclosure. Thus, the safest option was stasis. For requesters, the effect is numbing. Appeals produce the same language, sometimes with an added sentence confirming that the appeal has been reviewed. That sentence, too, becomes standardized over time. The repetition discourages persistence. After receiving the same letter twice, many stop asking. The system relies on fatigue as much as law. What is denied is not only information, but dialogue. As this part unfolds, the identical rejection begins to look less like an answer and more like a boundary marker, a sign indicating where inquiry ends, regardless of direction. Patterns emerge when enough requests are compared side by side. Researchers who compile rejection letters notice that even typographical quirks persist. A specific comma placement, a phrasing that reflects outdated legal terminology. These details act like fingerprints. They indicate origin. Tracing that origin reveals a small group of legal advisors who drafted the original language during a period of intense institutional anxiety. Public trust was low. Transparency reforms were new. Agencies feared exposure not just of secrets, but of past decisions that could not be easily defended. The template offered protection. It allowed agencies to comply procedurally while withholding substantively. It was a compromise that favored control. Over time, the compromise became normalized. New generations inherited the language without context. They applied it because it worked, not because they understood its origin. This loss of origin is important. When rules outlive their rationale, they become ritual. Rituals are resistant to challenge because they are no longer debated. They are performed. Bitter denial, in these cases, becomes ritualized secrecy. The identical wording also creates an illusion of coordination. Requests filed with different agencies receive responses that appear coordinated, even when they are not. The same language echoes across institutional boundaries, suggesting a unified wall. In reality, the unity is linguistic, not operational, yet language shapes perception. To the requester, the sameness implies a single authority, an unreachable center. As this part deepens, the focus shifts to the psychological impact of such uniform denial, how it shapes public behavior, how it teaches people what not to ask. Repeated exposure to identical rejection letters alters expectation. Requesters learn that precision does not matter. Narrowly scoped questions receive the same response as broad inquiries. Specific dates, names, and locations fail to elicit tailored answers. This teaches a lesson that effort is irrelevant. Over time, this lesson reduces the volume of requests in certain categories. People self-censor. They choose safer topics. The system benefits from this adaptation. It faces fewer challenges without issuing additional denials. This is quiet power. It operates without confrontation. Internally, the identical rejections are seen as success metrics. High closure rates, low appeal overturns, efficiency achieved. The quality of transparency is not measured. One internal report celebrates the reduction of processing time for sensitive requests after adoption of standardized language. Speed is praised. The cost is not discussed. The identical wording also protects individuals within the system. No single officer can be blamed for denial. They did not decide, they applied policy. Responsibility dissolves into process. As this part unfolds, the identical rejection letters appear less like bureaucratic artifacts and more like instruments, tools designed to shape behavior on both sides of the request. They are not lies, they are not explanations, they are endings. Occasionally, a requester persists long enough to force variation. A court orders a more detailed justification. A judge questions the adequacy of the template. In these rare cases, the response expands slightly. Yet even then, the core language remains. Additional sentences are appended, not substituted. The template survives intact, shielded by supplemental reasoning. This resilience reinforces its authority. The identical rejections thus become a stable feature of the transparency landscape. They define the limits of access without enumerating them. They say no without saying why. For historians and archivists, this presents a unique problem. The absence of information is consistent, but the reason for absence is opaque. The record shows denial, not substance. What is hidden remains undefined. As this part continues, the repetition itself becomes the story. The identical language is no longer just a means of refusal. It is evidence of a long-standing decision to treat certain categories of truth as permanently out of reach. FOIA requests that receive the same word-for-word rejection reveal a system that has learned how to deny without engaging. The repetition is deliberate. It protects secrets by exhausting inquiry. The template endures because it works. It reduces risk. It minimizes discussion. It teaches silence. What lies behind the identical language may vary. Different files, different histories, different consequences. Yet the response erases distinction. In doing so, it creates a final question that the letters never address. Not what is being hidden, but why the act of asking has been met with the same answer for so long. The archive does not resolve this. It simply preserves the pattern. And the pattern, repeated often enough, becomes its own form of truth. The pattern did not originate in a single building. That much becomes clear once the archive widens its scope. Similar hidden flaws appear in government structures across multiple cities, constructed during the same decades, following comparable design logic, and disappearing from public documentation in nearly identical ways. Individually, each case can be explained away as architectural oddity or classified necessity. Taken together, they form a system. The files that reference these spaces are scattered. Some are partially classified, others are encrypted beyond routine archival access. Many have been erased entirely, leaving only secondary references, footnotes that point to drawings that no longer exist. What remains is an anomaly repeated often enough to suggest planning rather than coincidence. A hidden truth expressed through repetition. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The atmosphere surrounding these discoveries is uniformly subdued. Cold fluorescent lighting, reinforced concrete corridors, security checkpoints designed less for control than for discouragement. In each building, the hidden floor occupies a liminal position. Not fully underground, not listed among the above-ground levels. A space between categories. Historical anchors place the emergence of these floors firmly within the Cold War. Between the late 1940s and early 1970s, federal construction standards quietly evolved. New buildings were designed not only for function but for contingency. Continuity of government plans demanded spaces that could operate independently, unseen. And UNACKNOWLEDGED. Architectural manuals from the era emphasize redundancy. They speak of survivability, of command resilience, of maintaining operations under extreme conditions. What they do not describe explicitly is how far these principles were taken. In Washington, similar hidden flaws were identified beneath administrative complexes officially described as having fewer levels. In the Midwest, a federal records facility was discovered to contain an intermediate floor sandwiched between storage levels, accessible only through service shafts not marked on public plans. On the West Coast, a communications building revealed an unlisted level during seismic retrofitting, sealed off decades earlier and never reopened. Each case shares key characteristics: access points disguised as maintenance areas, stairwells that skip numbers, elevator panels with missing buttons, blueprints that terminate or compress vertical space without explanation. Engineers encountering these inconsistencies often assume error. Drawings are imperfect, renovations alter structures. Over time, plans diverge from reality, but the repetition challenges this assumption. The same solutions appear in different regions, under different administrations, executed by different contractors. This consistency implies doctrine. The hidden flaws were not accidents of construction, they were features designed to be invisible to anyone without explicit need to know. Their concealment relied not only on physical barriers, but on bureaucratic silence. If a flaw does not exist on paper, it does not exist for inspectors, auditors, or the public. This invisibility extended to budgeting. Construction costs were folded into broader line items. Square footage calculations were adjusted. Nothing stood out unless one knew what to look for. Those who did look often stopped short of formal inquiry. Classified exemptions provided justification. National security rationales discouraged further questioning. The Cold War produced a culture where absence itself could be explained as protection. As this narration unfolds, the focus shifts from individual buildings to the network they suggest. Because hidden flaws are not useful in isolation, their value emerges when they are part of a larger architecture of secrecy and understanding. That architecture requires examining why so many different buildings, built for different purposes, shared the same hidden solution. I am continuing. Across these buildings, the hidden flaws were designed with remarkable restraint. They were not elaborate bunkers filled with equipment. Most were narrow, functional spaces, low ceilings, reinforced walls, minimal lighting. Their purpose was not comfort but continuity. What makes them unsettling is how deliberately ordinary they appear once found. Nothing about them suggests drama, no warning signs, no obvious markers of crisis. They look like places meant to be, used quietly, for long periods, without drawing attention. In several cases, ventilation systems serving these floors were routed separately from the rest of the building. Air intake points were disguised as structural features. Exhausts were blended into architectural elements. This separation ensured that activity on the hidden level would not register through temperature changes or airflow anomalies elsewhere. Electrical systems show similar isolation. Independent power feeds, backup generators positioned beyond standard emergency infrastructure. In at least one building, wiring diagrams indicate the hidden flaw could operate autonomously for extended durations. This autonomy suggests foresight. The designers anticipated scenarios where surface operations might be compromised. The hidden flaws were meant to persist, yet their purpose was never standardized publicly. Some appear configured for communications, others resemble administrative spaces. A few show evidence of temporary habitation, folding furniture, storage lockers, sanitary facilities designed for sustained use. None of these features appear in official descriptions. When renovations exposed these levels decades later, responses followed a familiar pattern. Discovery was acknowledged internally, access was restricted, documentation was updated selectively. Public records remained unchanged. In one instance, a hidden flaw was discovered during asbestos abatement. Contractors reported an unexpected slab. Work paused briefly, then resumed under revised instructions. The slab was sealed again. The contractors were reassigned. No public report followed. The speed of these responses indicates preparedness. Institutions knew how to handle such discoveries. Procedures existed, even if they were not written where most could see them. As this part deepens, attention turns to why these flaws were hidden so effectively. Physical concealment alone would not have sufficed. The true concealment occurred through training, expectation, and administrative habit. People working in these buildings learned, implicitly, which questions not to ask. Numbering systems played a crucial role in maintaining invisibility. Floor numbers skipped without comment. Elevators transitioned seamlessly from one level to another. Signage reinforced the illusion of continuity. Visitors rarely notice missing numbers. They assume convention. 13 is often omitted. Basements are renumbered. Mechanical levels are excluded. These practices create plausible cover. Hidden flaws exploited this familiarity in some buildings. Stairwells jump from level 2 to level 4. In others, a mezzanine absorbs the missing space. Blueprints compress vertical scale, adjusting proportions so the absence is not obvious unless measured precisely. Only specialists trained to reconcile. Drawings with physical dimensions would detect the inconsistency, and even then, Classification provided explanation. Security protocols reinforced this invisibility. Badges authorized access only to listed floors. Doors to hidden levels required mechanical keys or secondary authentication not integrated into standard systems. This ensured that access attempts were rare. Those granted access often described it as incidental. They were told they were entering a service area, or a legacy space, or a restricted utility zone. Labels mattered less than tone. The tone discouraged curiosity. Over time, the hidden floors faded from active use. Their original purpose, tied to Cold War contingencies, became obsolete, yet they were not removed. They were simply left sealed, preserved in administrative amber. Preservation without acknowledgement is a recurring theme. As decades passed, institutional memory thinned. Fewer people remembered why the floors existed. More people assumed they were anomalies best left undisturbed. This assumption was never challenged on this way. Secrecy outlived necessity. Comparative analysis reveals that these hidden floors were not unique to any single agency. Civil administration buildings, communication centers, research facilities, and logistical hubs all display similar features. This distribution suggests coordination at the policy level. Construction guidelines disseminated quietly, design principles shared without public debate, a shared understanding that certain capacities should exist without being seen. During the height of the Cold War, this logic was pervasive. Survival depended on redundancy, on the ability to operate under attack. Hidden spaces provided resilience, but resilience required silence. Public acknowledgement of such spaces would have undermined their purpose. It would have invited scrutiny. It would have signaled vulnerability. Thus, the hidden floors were erased not because they were shameful, but because they were meant to be neutral. Invisible options in a worst-case scenario. As this part unfolds, the question shifts. Not why these floors existed, but why they remain hidden now. Long after their original justification has faded, the continued concealment suggests that the floors acquired secondary significance. What begins as contingency can evolve into convenience. Spaces designed for emergency use can be repurposed quietly. Administrative functions migrate. Sensitive operations relocate. In a few documented cases, hidden floors were briefly reactivated during later crises. Not publicly acknowledged, but internally utilized. Their invisibility made them useful again. Afterward, they were sealed once more. This pattern reinforces the value of maintaining the illusion. As long as the space officially does not exist, it can be used without explanation. The archive hints at this through subtle markers. Maintenance records referencing legacy levels, security logs showing unexplained access points, energy consumption anomalies that resolve without comment. Each hint alone is inconclusive. Together, they suggest continuity of use. The hidden floors may no longer serve their original Cold War purpose, but they have not been abandoned. Similar hidden floors found in Cold War government buildings reveal a philosophy of architecture shaped by fear, foresight, and restraint. They are physical expressions of a time when survival demanded preparation without acknowledgement. Their persistence into the present raises quiet questions, not accusations. Questions. What functions require such invisibility today? What decisions benefit from space that cannot be referenced? What activities are easier to conduct when they are structurally absent from record? The archive does not answer these questions. It only shows that the pattern exists, repeated across geography and decades. And as long as the floors remain hidden, the reasons for hiding them remain open. The room does not invite entry. Even before theories emerge, even before documents are compared, the physical cues alone suggest finality. Doors without handles, access panels welded shut, control interfaces removed rather than disabled. The architecture itself communicates a decision that predates any living memory. Whatever this room once was, it was not meant to be returned to. The file associated with the room is classified. Its access logs are encrypted. Earlier references have been erased, leaving only fragments that acknowledge its existence without describing its function. This absence is the anomaly, a hidden truth defined not by secrecy alone, but by deliberate abandonment. The room was sealed in a way that suggests not protection, but prevention. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The atmosphere surrounding the room is unusually quiet, even by institutional standards. Nearby corridors are over-reinforced. Surveillance coverage narrows as one approaches. Sound behaves differently, dampened by dense material layered over decades. The room sits outside the rhythm of the building, as if it no longer participates in daily operations. Historical anchors trace the sealing of similar rooms to periods of abrupt transition, endings rather than beginnings. Facilities reports from the late Cold War reference spaces taken out of service permanently. The language is vague, no decommissioning plans follow, no repurposing is suggested. Permanent, in this context, does not mean inactive, it means untouched. What distinguishes this room from other restricted areas is the absence of contingency. Most sealed spaces retain some protocol for re-entry, emergency procedures, preservation checks. This room does not. It is excluded even from plans designed for failure. Engineers reviewing the structure decades later note design choices that complicate access intentionally. Load-bearing elements are arranged so that removal would destabilize adjacent sections. Ventilation ducts are rerouted to bypass the space entirely. Power lines terminate before reaching its perimeter. These are not signs of neglect. They are signs of conclusion. The prevailing theory does not argue that the room contains something dangerous. It suggests something unresolved, a process that could not be completed, an experiment that could not be dismantled, a situation frozen not because it was successful, but because it could not be reversed safely. This theory emerges slowly, through comparison rather than assertion. Similar rooms appear in different facilities, sealed during different years, yet sharing common features. No documentation of cleanup, no transfer of contents, just closure. As this narration unfolds, the focus moves away from speculation and toward intention. Because rooms are not sealed forever by accident, decisions of this magnitude are made carefully, even when their rationale is later obscured. And understanding why a room was never meant to be entered again requires examining not what was inside it, but what would happen if it were disturbed. The decision to deny re-entry reshapes how the room is remembered. Over time, it stops being described as a space and starts being treated as a condition. Maintenance schedules refer to it indirectly, noting only that surrounding systems must remain stable. No inspections are planned. No sensors are installed inside. The absence becomes policy. This kind of exclusion suggests that monitoring itself was considered a risk. In most sealed environments, sensors are the compromise. They allow observation without intrusion. Here, even that step was avoided. Whatever existed inside the room was meant to remain unmeasured. Architectural revisions reinforce this interpretation. Later blueprints redraw circulation paths to reduce proximity. Emergency egress routes curve away. Fire suppression zones terminate at reinforced barriers. In effect, the building learns to route around the room, treating it as a fixed obstacle rather than a usable volume. Employees who work nearby often do not know the room exists. Those who do are vague about its purpose. Stories circulate quietly. An experiment halted mid-process, a prototype that could not be dismantled, a system that behaved unpredictably once activated. None of these stories are supported by documentation, yet their persistence suggests a shared intuition. The intuition is that the room contains a process rather than an object, something that does not simply sit dormant, but remains in a state that would change if disturbed. This distinction matters. Objects can be removed, processes must be completed, reversed, or stabilized. If none of those options are available, sealing becomes the only remaining action. Historical context supports this view. During periods of rapid technological development, especially under pressure, systems were sometimes built faster than they were understood. In rare cases, those systems reached a point where shutting them down safely was uncertain. Rather than risk escalation, containment was chosen. Containment without resolution is inherently uneasy. It relies on time as a stabilizing force. The hope is that conditions will degrade naturally, or that relevance will fade. But relevance does not fade uniformly. It lingers in architecture. Over decades, institutional memory erodes. People forget why a space is sealed, but they remember that it should remain so. The reason becomes less important than the rule. Do not enter. Do not disturb. Do not ask. This rule persists because it has never been tested. As this part deepens, the theory shifts from what the room contains to what the act of opening it would represent. Not curiosity, but defiance of a decision made under circumstances no longer visible, and that defiance carries implications that extend beyond the room itself. There is a distinct difference between rooms that are restricted and rooms that are abandoned by design. Restricted rooms remain within the system. They are referenced, audited, and revisited. Their purpose may be concealed, but their existence is acknowledged. This room does not behave that way. It has been removed not only from access, but from narrative. In archival language, It exists only as a negative space. References point around it. Floor plans compress. Maintenance zones stop short. The room becomes a gap in logic that no one is tasked with resolving. This treatment suggests that reopening the room would not simply reveal information, it would reopen responsibility. Responsibility is heavier than secrecy. To acknowledge the room would require explaining why it was sealed. Explanation would require revisiting the conditions that led to sealing. Those conditions may involve decisions that no longer fit modern standards, legal frameworks, or ethical boundaries, that it is easier to let the room remain unentered than to re-evaluate the moment that closed it. In some facilities, similar rooms were sealed after internal reviews determined that dismantling carried unacceptable risk not necessarily to physical safety, but to continuity, to reputation, to institutional coherence. Once something has been built, activated, and found to be unmanageable, admitting that fact can be more destabilizing than hiding it. Silence becomes a stabilizer. Engineers who later examine the structure note signs of long-term planning, materials chosen for longevity rather than access, reinforcement designed to resist decay. The room was not sealed temporarily. It was preserved in isolation. This preservation implies expectation. Someone anticipated that the room would persist long after its purpose ended, that future generations would inherit it without context. The theory gains weight here. The room was never meant to be entered again because entry itself would force a reckoning that time was meant to avoid. In controlled speculation, patterns matter more than conclusions. When multiple sealed rooms across different facilities show the same characteristics, coincidence becomes unlikely. Doors removed instead of locked, systems disconnected instead of powered down, documentation halted rather than archived. These choices indicate a philosophy of finality. During the Cold War, certain projects operated at the edge of understanding. Speed often outpaced comprehension. Systems were deployed under pressure, with the assumption that refinement would follow. In rare cases, refinement never came. What remained was something operational but unresolved. If such a system could not be safely shut down, sealing the environment around it would be the least disruptive option. Not resolution, but postponement indefinitely. This is not the same as hiding danger. It is hiding uncertainty. Uncertainty is harder to defend. It lacks clear boundaries. It invites questions that may not have answers. By sealing the room and erasing its administrative footprint, the institution ensured that uncertainty remained contained, not solved, but dormant. As decades pass, the room's continued isolation becomes self-justifying. No incidents occur. No alarms sound. The decision appears validated by time, yet time does not eliminate all processes. Some simply slow. The most compelling aspect of the theory is how little effort is made to disprove it. No official statements deny it. No documents refute it. The room's absence from discourse is total. In bureaucratic systems, denial is often louder than silence. Silence suggests avoidance. Those who propose reopening the room are gently redirected. Budget constraints, structural concerns, safety reviews that never conclude. The process absorbs the proposal without resolving it. This absorption mirrors how the room itself is treated, a problem rooted away rather than addressed. The theory does not require that something catastrophic lies inside. It only requires that whatever lies inside represents unfinished business, a decision interrupted, a process frozen, an outcome never reached. Entering the room would force completion. Completion would require judgment. Judgment would assign responsibility, and responsibility is what the room was designed to escape. The theory that the room was never meant to be entered again rests not on fear, but on restraint. It suggests that at some point, continuing was deemed more dangerous than stopping, and stopping was deemed impossible, so the system chose neither. It chose sealing. The room remains unchanged, not as a threat, but as a reminder of limits. Limits of knowledge, limits of control, limits of the decisions made under pressure. The archive does not confirm the theory. It does not deny it. It preserves the conditions that allow it to persist, and as long as the room remains sealed, the question it represents remains unanswered. Not because it cannot be asked, but because asking it would require opening something that was never meant to be touched again. The avoidance is not accidental. Digital records do not simply fail to include the area, they actively route around it. Databases skip its coordinates. File paths terminate early. Automated mapping tools compress space where the area should be. The omission is consistent across systems built decades apart, using different software, different standards, and different assumptions. This consistency is the anomaly. The file that documents the behavior is classified. Its system logs are encrypted. Earlier diagnostic reports have been erased. What remains is a hidden truth revealed through absence. The area exists physically, yet digital systems behave as if acknowledging it would introduce instability. The avoidance appears intentional, embedded at the level of design rather than operation. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The atmosphere surrounding this digital silence is calm and procedural. Server rooms hum softly. Cooling systems cycle at predictable intervals. Data flows continuously, indexed, mirrored, backed up, and yet, when spatial references approach the restricted area, the logic changes. Indexing stops. References resolve to null. The system does not flag an error. It simply declines to proceed. This behavior first appears in digitization efforts during the late 20th century, when analog records were migrated into electronic form. Engineers mapping floor plans into early computer-aided design systems noticed compression artifacts. Measurements that should have produced conflicts instead normalized. The software behaved as if the missing space had been accounted for elsewhere, rather than investigate. Technicians adjusted parameters. They assumed rounding error, legacy, distortion. The explanations were plausible. The systems stabilized. As digital infrastructure matured, the avoidance persisted. Geographic information systems mirrored the same gap. Asset management databases showed contiguous structures where physical inspection revealed discontinuity. Even security software, designed to track movement, registered no traversals through the area. Paths curved subtly, rerouting without triggering alerts. This is not how systems usually fail. Failure produces noise. Logs fill with errors. Alerts cascade. Here, there is none of that. The systems remain quiet. Historical anchors trace this behavior back to a set of internal guidelines circulated during early digitization. The guidelines instructed teams to respect non-representable zones. The phrase is undefined. It appears briefly, then disappears from later documentation, but its influence remains. Non-representable does not mean unknown. It means deliberately excluded. The choice to exclude an area from digital representation carries consequences. Modern institutions rely on digital records to define reality. What cannot be indexed cannot be what cannot be queried cannot be reviewed. The area becomes operationally invisible. This invisibility compounds over time. New systems ingest old data. They inherit the gap without questioning it. Machine learning models trained on incomplete maps reinforce the omission. The absence becomes normalized. Then reinforced algorithmically. Engineers encountering the issue decades later often assume corruption. They attempt to repair the dataset. Their tools report consistency. There is nothing to fix. The avoidance appears to be working as designed. As this narration continues, the focus moves from how the records avoid the area to why avoidance was chosen over deletion or mislabeling. Because deletion leaves traces, avoidance leaves none. And that distinction suggests a deeper intent. One aligned not with secrecy alone, but with stability. The decision to make an area digitally non-representable reshapes how systems understand space. Most databases assume continuity. Rooms connect, floors stack, coordinates resolve cleanly. When an exception is introduced, it must be handled deliberately. Otherwise, the system breaks. Here, the system does not break, it adapts. Developers reviewing legacy code notice conditional statements that redirect queries away from certain ranges. The conditions are written plainly, without explanation. They appear early in the logic, before validation steps. This placement ensures that the exclusion occurs silently. No error is generated because, from the system's perspective, the request was never valid. This approach is elegant. It avoids conflict. It prevents discovery through troubleshooting. Documentation for these conditions is sparse. Comments reference internal standards that no longer exist. Change logs note compatibility adjustments without detail. Over successive updates, the logic is preserved verbatim, copied forward to maintain backward compatibility. Backward compatibility, in this case, preserves omission. As digital twins of physical spaces became more sophisticated, the same pattern held. Three-dimensional models interpolated around the missing area. Rendering engines smoothed geometry. Collision detection treated the space as solid mass, not empty volume. The result was a digital environment that behaved plausibly while remaining incomplete. Users navigating these models rarely noticed. Visual coherence was maintained. Functional requirements were met. The missing area did not interfere with tasks. This is the key to the avoidance. It does not obstruct, it accommodates. Security systems exhibit similar behavior. Access logs show no entries because no access points are defined. Sensors do not fail, they simply do not exist within the excluded zone. Monitoring dashboards display uninterrupted coverage. From an oversight perspective, this is ideal. Nothing appears wrong. The avoidance also protects against future scrutiny, as oversight increasingly relies on data-driven analysis. Areas that do not exist digitally cannot be flagged by algorithms. They fall outside audit scope by design. As this part deepens, it becomes clear that the digital exclusion is not a patch applied after the fact. It is foundational. It shapes how every subsequent system interacts with the space. The most unsettling implication of this design is how well it aligns with institutional incentives. Digital records promise transparency, traceability, and control, but they also create vulnerability. What is recorded can be reviewed. What is indexed can be subpoenaed. What is logged can be reconstructed. By excluding an area from digital representation, the institution reduces risk without overtly violating policy. There is no falsification, there is no deletion, there is only absence. Absence is difficult to challenge. Auditors, working purely from digital records, will never encounter the gap. Their tools confirm completeness. Their queries return expected results. The system validates itself. Only when digital and physical inspections are compared does the discrepancy emerge, and such comparisons are rare. Even then, classification provides explanation. Physical access is restricted. Digital access is incomplete. The mismatch is attributed to security requirements. This explanation is accepted because it aligns with expectation. Over time, digital avoidance becomes self-reinforcing. New policies assume the digital map is authoritative. Physical anomalies are treated as legacy quirks. The burden of proof shifts away from the system. This dynamic illustrates a broader principle. Digital records do not merely describe reality, they define it. By choosing not to define an area, the institution removes it from operational reality. As this part unfolds, attention shifts to how this avoidance affects memory, because digital systems are now the primary repositories of institutional history. When records are digitized, physical archives are often deprioritized, paper files are stored off-site. Access becomes cumbersome. Researchers rely on digital catalogs. What is not catalogued is rarely requested. The excluded area suffers this fate. Its paper records, if they exist, are scattered. Some are classified, others are misfiled. Without digital references, there is no index to guide retrieval. As generations pass, institutional memory becomes increasingly digital. New staff are trained on systems that never reference the area. To them, it does not exist. This absence affects decision-making. Renovations are planned digitally. Risk assessments are modeled computationally. Emergency scenarios are simulated without the excluded zone. The building is understood without it. This understanding becomes normative. Any suggestion that something is missing feels disruptive. The digital model has become truth. As this part deepens, the avoidance takes on philosophical weight. It is not just a technical choice. It is a statement about what counts as knowable. Occasionally, the avoidance is challenged unintentionally. Software upgrades introduce new validation routines. Data migrations apply stricter schema enforcement. In these moments, the exclusion must be actively preserved. Change requests appear, quietly approved, to maintain legacy behavior. Engineers are told not to refactor certain modules. The reasons are vague: stability, security, compliance. Compliance with what is never specified. These interventions demonstrate that the avoidance is maintained deliberately, even as systems evolve. Someone understands its importance, yet no central authority claims ownership. Responsibility is diffused. Each team preserves the behavior because it is inherited. This diffusion mirrors the physical concealment. No single barrier explains the exclusion. It is sustained through many small decisions. As this part continues, the pattern becomes clear. The area is protected not by secrecy alone, but by normalization of absence. Digital records avoid the area entirely because avoidance is safer than representation. Representation invites inquiry. Avoidance dissolves it by never allowing the area to enter the data. The institution ensures that future systems will not ask about it. Algorithms cannot flag what they cannot see. Audits cannot review what is not indexed. The hidden space becomes structurally irrelevant, even as it remains physically present. This strategy reflects a deep understanding of how modern systems operate. Control no longer depends on locking doors. It depends on shaping data. The archive does not explain this choice explicitly. It does not need to. The behavior speaks for itself, and as long as digital records continue to define reality, the area will remain where it has always been, present, inaccessible, and effectively erased by design. The project did not end with an explosion, or an evacuation, or a public failure. It ended quietly, beneath layers of ice that moved faster than records could follow. What remains in the archive is not a conclusion, but a disappearance, a series of documents that narrow, fragment, and then stop. The last intact file is classified, its annexes are encrypted, its appendices have been erased. The anomaly is not that the project failed, it is that it vanished so completely that even its absence appears deliberate. This is the hidden truth the archive cannot resolve. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The atmosphere surrounding the project is defined by cold, not just environmental but procedural. The facility was located deep within Siberia, chosen for isolation rather than efficiency. Permafrost provided stability, distance provided silence. Logistics reports describe extreme measures taken to maintain supply lines during winter months. Everything about the location suggests permanence. And yet, permanence was not achieved. The project emerged during the later years of the Cold War, when rival states pursued parallel ambitions under conditions of secrecy and urgency. Scientific initiatives were launched faster than oversight structures could mature. Success was measured in strategic advantage, not sustainability. In this climate, projects were allowed to exist on the margins of comprehension. Officially, the installation was described as a research outpost. Its stated purpose shifted over time. Geological surveys, atmospheric sampling, energy experimentation, each description was plausible. None were complete. Early planning documents emphasize containment. Structures were designed to be modular, capable of rapid isolation. Redundant power systems were installed beneath the ice. Heat management was treated as a primary concern, not for comfort, but for control. Engineers anticipated interaction between the facility and its environment that could not be fully predicted. Personnel records show a rotating staff, many present for short durations. Specialists arrived, worked in isolation, and departed without overlap. Knowledge was compartmentalized. No individual appears to have held a comprehensive understanding of the project's scope. This compartmentalization becomes significant when the project begins to fade from record. Budget allocations are rerouted. Supply shipments decrease. Communications logs thin. Eventually, only automated systems report status, and then those reports cease as well. Satellite imagery from the period shows subtle changes. Snow cover shifts. Surface structures are dismantled. Access routes are erased by deliberate inaction. The ice advances, reclaiming the site. No decommissioning report exists. The absence of such a report suggests that decommissioning was not possible or not desired, or not safe. Later inquiries encounter resistance framed as irrelevant. The project is described as obsolete, its data as superseded, its physical remnants as inaccessible. Inaccessibility becomes the final justification. As this narration continues, the focus will move from what the project was meant to achieve to why it could not be concluded cleanly. Because projects that vanish into ice rarely do so by accident, they are left behind when retrieval carries greater risk than abandonment, and understanding that risk requires following the archive to the point where it stops speaking. The silence that follows the disappearance of a project is often louder than its operation. In the Siberian archive, silence takes the form of gaps that are too evenly spaced to be accidental. Weekly status reports end on the same date across multiple departments. Environmental readings cease within minutes of one another. Even the automated weather station that should have continued transmitting for decades falls quiet. This coordination implies intent, not collapse. Archived correspondence from the final operational year reveals a subtle shift in tone. Language becomes procedural, cautious, stripped of speculation. Engineers stop proposing modifications and begin requesting confirmations. Scientists stop asking questions and begin documenting observations without interpretation. It is as if the project entered a phase where understanding was no longer encouraged. One memo, dated late winter, references boundary conditions. The term appears repeatedly without definition. Boundary conditions are mentioned in relation to power output, thermal gradients, and structural stress. The repetition suggests a shared concern, yet no explanatory appendix accompanies the references. Whatever boundary was being approached, it was not meant to be described plainly. Interviews conducted years later with individuals tangentially connected to the supply chain provide fragmented recollections. Drivers recall deliveries rerouted without explanation. Equipment manifests list components that were never installed elsewhere. A refrigeration unit designed for continuous operation was shipped, then returned unused, then shipped again under a different designation. These inconsistencies point toward experimentation under conditions that resisted standard classification. The project appears to have produced data that could not be reconciled with existing frameworks. When such data emerges, institutions often respond by narrowing access rather than expanding inquiry. The final recorded human presence at the site is marked by a short notation in a logistics ledger. No names, no reasons. Simply a confirmation that personnel rotation had been suspended indefinitely. Suspension implies expectation of resumption. That resumption never occurred. What replaced human oversight was automation. Systems designed to operate without intervention took control. These systems logged internal states, not interpretations, temperature, pressure, energy flux. For a time, these numbers remained within anticipated ranges. Then they did not. The anomaly does not manifest as a spike or a crash. It manifests as drift. Values slowly diverge from models without triggering alarms. Thresholds are not crossed. Instead, the meaning of the thresholds erodes. At this point in the archive, commentary ceases. Only raw data remains unannotated. And then, abruptly, even that ends. Not with a final reading, but with an absence, as though the system itself chose to stop recording. To understand why the project could not be concluded, one must examine what it sought to observe. Secondary documents hint at an interest in energy behaviors under extreme isolation. The Siberian ice provided not just cold, but stability, a medium that moved slowly, predictably, yet exerted immense pressure over time. Some theorize that the project investigated long-duration energy containment. Others suggest it explored interactions between geological formations and artificial fields. The truth is likely narrower and stranger than either explanation. A declassified planning note references persistent states. The phrase appears in relation to materials exposed to continuous input without dissipation. Persistent states challenge assumptions about equilibrium. They suggest systems that do not resolve, do not decay, but continue indefinitely once initiated. Such systems are rare in controlled environments. They are rarer still in nature. If the project succeeded in creating or observing a persistent state, it would have confronted a phenomenon that resisted shutdown. Shutdown procedures exist for machines, reactors, and experiments. They do not exist for conditions that have become self-sustaining without clear boundaries. If the project crossed that threshold, decommissioning would not have been a matter of flipping a switch. The decision to abandon rather than dismantle begins to make sense in this context. Ice becomes a containment strategy, not perfect, but gradual. Pressure and cold slow processes that cannot be stopped outright. Later analysis of regional temperature anomalies reveals a subtle pattern. The ice above the site exhibits marginally different thermal behavior, not warmer, not colder, but slower to respond to seasonal change. This lag is slight, measurable only over decades, yet it persists. Attempts to revisit the site have been proposed and quietly rejected. Official reasons: site cost and environmental hazard. Unofficially, the concern appears to be unpredictability. The ice has shifted. The original structures are no longer accessible. Whatever was left behind has had time to interact with its environment without observation. In such cases, ignorance becomes a form of safety. The archive does not confirm what remains beneath the ice. It only confirms that the decision to leave it there was unanimous among those who knew enough to vote. Unanimity in bureaucratic systems is rare. It suggests fear rather than consensus. As decades pass, the project becomes a footnote. References appear in unrelated documents as examples of legacy infrastructure. The language is intentionally vague. Legacy implies age, not danger. Infrastructure implies inertness. Together they neutralize curiosity, yet curiosity persists outside official channels. Independent researchers notice the patterns. They compare satellite data. They file requests for clarification. The responses they receive are identical word for word across agencies and years. This uniformity is itself an anomaly. The rejection letters cite classification, then irrelevance, then national interest. The order never changes. It is as if the response was templated once and never revisited. Templates endure when no one wants to reopen the subject. One researcher notes that the rejection letters reference a regulatory framework that no longer exists. This suggests that the process governing the project's secrecy has outlived its legal justification. It continues by inertia. Inertia is a recurring theme. The project did not explode. It did not fail publicly. It did not demand resolution. It simply continued beyond the point where resolution was possible, and so it was left to persist unseen. Speculation about the nature of the persistent state varies. Some suggest it was informational rather than energetic, a configuration that, once established, influenced surrounding systems without direct interaction. Others propose it was physical, a structure that altered its environment subtly, continuously. What unites these theories is the recognition that the project challenged assumptions about containment. If something cannot be fully isolated, the best option may be distance and time. Time has been applied generously. Enough time that those who authorized the abandonment are gone. Enough time that the original purpose is obscured. Enough time that the ice has incorporated the site into itself. But time does not erase all traces. It only makes them harder to interpret in recent years. Climate change has introduced a variable that the original planners did not anticipate. The ice is changing, not rapidly, but measurably. As it shifts, questions arise about what might be revealed. No official monitoring program exists for the site. That absence is notable. Sites of purely historical interest are often studied as they emerge. This one is not. Its continued burial appears to be preferred. Internal assessments, obtained indirectly, frame the situation as stable. Stability here does not mean safe. It means unchanged within acceptable parameters. Acceptable to whom is not specified. The final documents in the archive do not offer closure. They offer deferral. Statements like "no action required at this time" recur. Time passes. The statements are never updated. Deferral becomes a policy. The project's true legacy may not be what it created, but what it demonstrated about institutional limits. There are phenomena that systems are not prepared to integrate. When confronted with such phenomena, the response may be to narrow vision rather than expand understanding. The ice is indifferent to policy, continues its slow work. Pressure increases, structures deform, materials adapt. Whatever state was established beneath the surface has had decades to evolve under conditions never intended to support. Observation. This is the risk implicit in abandonment, not that something will suddenly emerge, but that it will continue to change beyond the frame of reference that once defined it. The archive ends where certainty ends. There is no final report, no concluding analysis, only a recognition, implicit in the silence, that some projects are not meant to be revisited. The Siberian ice holds many secrets. Most are geological, some are historical, a few are intentional. This project belongs to the last category. Its secrecy was not designed to protect information indefinitely, but to allow time to pass without interference. Whether that strategy succeeded is impossible to know. Success implies an outcome that can be evaluated. Here, evaluation has been deferred indefinitely. As listeners, we are left with the shape of a story rather than its resolution. A project initiated with describes one-time asset utilization. The phrase is used in reference to people, not equipment. The implication is subtle. Assets are consumed by use. Once used, they are not retained. The contractors may have understood this implicitly. Their contracts, where available, are sparse. Many lack standard clauses regarding dispute resolution or late payment. Several are missing entirely, referenced only indirectly by project codes. What exists suggests agreements designed to limit paper, not clarify rights. As this part unfolds, the financial anomaly begins to resemble a structural feature rather than an error, a method of engaging labor without creating lasting obligation, a way to accomplish tasks that could not be associated with ongoing employment or traceable compensation. The question is no longer why the contractors were unpaid. It is why the system went to such lengths to ensure that their participation could not be followed through. Money is one of the most reliable forms of evidence. It connects individuals to institutions through undeniable transaction. Remove the transaction, and the connection weakens. Remove it entirely, and the relationship becomes difficult to prove. This principle appears repeatedly in classified operations where deniability is prioritized. Financial distance creates narrative distance. Without payment records, involvement becomes speculative. The unpaid contractors fit this pattern too, precisely to be accidental. Several project codes linked to these cases overlap with known periods of structural modification, emergency containment, and rapid response activity. Tasks completed under these codes often align with events that were later concealed, reclassified, or physically erased. The contractors were present at moments of transition. Their labor enabled change. Their absence from payroll enabled forgetting. In one case, a contractor was assigned to overnight electrical rerouting. The project is logged as completed successfully. The system affected was later decommissioned. The contractor's name appears nowhere else. There is no evidence of compensation. There is also no evidence of complaint. This silence suggests consent, not necessarily enthusiasm, but acceptance. Why would someone accept such terms? One explanation lies in how the work was framed. Short duration, high urgency, exceptional circumstances. Participants may have been told that standard procedures did not apply, that compensation would be handled separately, that documentation would follow later. Later never came. Another possibility is more troubling, that the contractors were selected precisely because they could disappear without consequence. Individuals with limited ties, foreign nationals, temporary residents, people for whom formal recourse was difficult or undesirable. Yet even this does not fully explain the lack of dispute. Human beings tend to seek closure. They ask questions. They follow up, unless they are given a reason not to. Non-disclosure agreements attached to some of these cases are unusually broad. They prohibit discussion not only of work performed, but of terms of engagement. Speaking about payment, or lack thereof, would itself constitute a violation. In this framework, silence becomes compliance. The system does not need to enforce payment if it can enforce quiet, and quiet, in sensitive contexts, may be valued more highly than money. As this part continues, the anomaly shifts from financial to psychological. What kind of agreement persuades someone to work, accept risk, and then vanish without record or protest? The answer may lie in what the contractors were allowed to see, and what they were warned never to discuss. The warnings, when they appear in surviving documents, are indirect. They speak of national interest, of temporary necessity, of work that must be completed without delay or attribution. The language avoids explicit threats. It relies instead on implication. Several contractors signed acknowledgments stating that participation constituted acceptance of special conditions. These conditions are not defined. They are referenced as understood. Understanding, in this context, replaces consent. One internal briefing note describes a category of labor engagement as self-terminating. The phrase suggests that once the task is complete, the relationship ends automatically. No follow-up, no continuation, no obligation on either side. From an administrative perspective, this is efficient. It minimizes exposure. It reduces record keeping. It aligns with operations that must not linger in institutional memory. From a human perspective, it is unsettling. The lack of payment becomes symbolic. It marks the contractor as someone who was never meant to be fully acknowledged. Their contribution exists only insofar as the outcome exists. They themselves remain peripheral. In later years, as auditing standards tightened, these anomalies became harder to justify. Financial systems grew more integrated, gaps became more visible, yet the unpaid contractor cases were never resolved. They were grandfathered into silence,